The desert wind carried secrets across the Texas plains, whispering through the dried grass and rattling the rusted barbed wire. Frank Harmon stood motionless at the eastern perimeter of his property, listening to the rhythm of boots on gravel, his own the only human sound for 30 miles in any direction. His weathered hands inspected the fence post, checking for weakness, for vulnerability, for any sign that his carefully constructed isolation had been compromised. 53 months. That's how long he'd been alone. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the barren ground. Frank's eyes, sharp despite his 43 years, scanned the distant ridgeline with the practiced precision of a man who once commanded others to live or die based on what he saw. His fingers tightened around the fence post, and suddenly he wasn't in Texas anymore. Kandahar Province, 2007. The air thick with dust and gunpowder. His 12-man team pinned down in a narrow ravine, Taliban fighters on three sides. Radio dead. No air support coming. Positions tight. Conserve ammo. His voice cutting through the chaos as rounds impacted inches from his head. Jackson, I need that 50 up on the North Ridge now. The weight of command. The weight of lives. Frank blinked and the memory dissolved back into the Texas sunset. He exhaled slowly, forcing his grip to relax. 5 years since he'd left Special Forces. 5 years since he'd commanded men in battle. 5 years trying to forget the weight. He adjusted the worn M1911 .45 caliber sidearm at his hip, a soldier's habit never truly forgotten, and continued his perimeter check. Lone Pine Ranch wasn't just his home. It was his fortress, his sanctuary, his penance. The two-story ranch house stood centered on 100 acres of hard-scrabbled Texas land 30 miles from the nearest paved road, 40 from town. To most, it would seem ordinary, weathered wood siding, metal roof, wraparound porch with a swing that creaked in the wind. But Frank hadn't built it for others to see. He'd built it to withstand. Hidden beneath the rural charm were reinforced walls that could stop small arms fire. The windows, few and narrow, were positioned for optimal defensive fields of fire. The storm cellar wasn't just for tornadoes. It housed enough supplies to last months. The barn contained more than farm equipment. Frank Harmon hadn't just built a home. He'd built a redoubt. As dusk settled across the land, he made his way back toward the house, boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel path. His trained eye noted everything: the distant hawk circling for one last hunt, the shifting shadows as night approached, the subtle movement of the wind through the single pine tree that gave his ranch its name. Inside the cabin was spare but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold despite the evening chill. Frank moved with quiet efficiency, lighting a single lamp, its warm glow barely pushing back the darkness. On the mantel, a single photograph faced the wall, the only one he'd kept. He didn't need to see it to remember. Rebecca's smile, the way the sunlight caught in her auburn hair, that day at Galveston Beach. Anna, just 5 years old, balanced on her mother's hip, tiny hand waving at the camera. At him. His fingers worked mechanically, field stripping and cleaning his sidearm, a ritual that required no thought, leaving his mind free to wander dangerous paths. 7 minutes later, the weapon was reassembled, oiled, and returned to its holster. Frank moved to the kitchen, heated a can of beans on the ancient gas stove. His dinner routine never varied: simple, efficient, solitary. Through the window, he watched the first stars appear. People once looked to stars for guidance, for meaning. Frank only saw them as navigational references, cold points of light in an indifferent sky. After dinner, he sat at the rough-hewn table, a worn leather-bound journal open before him. It wasn't a diary. Frank Harmon wasn't a man who believed his feelings deserved documentation. It was a tactical assessment: weather conditions, security observations, supply inventory. The practical accounting of a man who had reduced his existence to its most defensible elements. He wrote the date at the top of the page, January 17, 2022, and paused. 5 years since the accident. 5 years since he'd held his daughter. 5 years since the courtroom where the judge had looked at him with pity rather than respect. Mr. Harmon, while your service to this country is commendable, your psychological evaluation indicates persistent PTSD symptoms that create an unstable environment. Until you complete the recommended treatment program, I have no choice but to award full custody to your sister-in-law, Sandra Miller. The pen stilled in his hand. He'd never gone to the treatment. Pride, perhaps, or fear of what they might find beneath the armor he'd spent decades building. Instead, he'd retreated here to build walls of a different kind. Thunder rumbled in the distance, drawing his attention back to the present. A storm was moving in from the west. Frank noted it in his journal, estimated time of arrival, potential rainfall impact on perimeter security. The practical assessments of a soldier who couldn't stop being vigilant even when there was nothing left to protect. He closed the journal and moved to check the locks, another nightly ritual. Front door iron bar across solid oak. Back door deadbolt and chair wedged under the handle. Windows secured with both conventional locks and custom reinforcements. The precautions might seem paranoid to most, but to Frank they were as natural as breathing. The storm drew closer, lightning illuminating the landscape in brief electric flashes. Rain began to fall gentle at first, then heavier drumming against the metal roof like distant gunfire. Frank stood by the front window, gazing out into the darkness. In 5 years, no one had come looking for him. No one had knocked on his door. No one had a sound cut through the storm. Not thunder, not wind, not rain. Knocking. Hard, urgent knocking at his front door. Frank froze, every muscle tensing, mind instantly alert. No one came here. No one knew he was here. No one should be here. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, drawing it in one smooth motion. 5 years of isolation vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold focus of combat readiness. The knocking came again, more insistent, then a voice, female, authoritative despite its exhaustion. "Please, we need help. We're soldiers." Frank moved silently to the narrow window beside the door position, shielded from outside view. What he saw made his breath catch. Illuminated by a flash of lightning, 11 figures in military fatigues, rain-soaked and mud-splattered. Women, all of them. Some wounded, one with a makeshift bandage around her thigh, another supporting a comrade who could barely stand. Their posture, even in exhaustion, unmistakable. These weren't civilians playing dress-up. These were trained soldiers. At the front stood a woman of about 35, rain plastering dark hair to her face as she scanning the property with tactical awareness, even as she knocked again. The insignia on her sodden uniform, "Captain." "Please," she called again. "We've been traveling for 2 days. We need shelter." Frank remained motionless, assessing. This could be a trap, a ruse to gain entry. Intelligence forces used such tactics, he'd employed them himself in another life. But something about their posture, their formation, even in distress, spoke of genuine need. Then he heard a sound that cut through his tactical calculations like a blade. A child's cry, faint but unmistakable. He shifted his position slightly, looking beyond the captain to the rear of the group. A young woman, barely more than a girl, cradled a small bundle against her chest, trying to shield it from the rain. An infant face flushed with cold and wet with tears. Something cracked inside Frank Harmon's carefully fortified heart. 5 years of silence. 5 years of solitude. 5 years of building walls against the world that had taken everything from him. And now, standing at his door in the rain, were 11 soldiers and a baby asking him to let them in. The captain's voice came again, lower this time, almost resigned. "Sir, I know you're in there. We're not a threat. But if you don't help us tonight, I can't guarantee we'll all make it until morning." Frank closed his eyes. For a moment, he saw Rebecca's face, the last time he'd kissed her goodbye. He heard Anna's laughter as he'd swung her high in the air before his final deployment. He felt the weight of the courtroom gavel as it fell, severing him from the last person who mattered. His hand moved to the iron bar across the door. It had remained in place for 1/8/26 nights. Tonight it slid free. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo across 5 years of silence. Rain and wind rushed in, carrying the scent of mud, sweat, and something else, fear. Not panic, but the controlled fear of soldiers who knew exactly what was hunting them. The captain didn't move at first, her gray eyes assessing him with the same caution he'd shown her. Then she straightened slightly, military bearing reasserting itself despite her exhaustion. "Captain Maria Ramirez, 75th Ranger Regiment," she said, her voice steady despite chattering teeth. "These are my soldiers." Frank nodded once, stepping back from the doorway. "Frank Harmon," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Get inside, quickly." They moved with disciplined efficiency, helping the wounded, maintaining formation even as they entered. The young woman with the baby came last, her face streaked with tears and mud, but her eyes clear and determined. Captain Ramirez remained on the porch a moment longer, scanning the darkness beyond the barn, her posture alert despite obvious fatigue. "They'll be coming," she said quietly. Frank asked only one question. "Who?" Maria turned to face him fully, and in her eyes, he saw something he recognized: the weight of command, of responsibility, of lives, depending on decisions. "Our own," she said simply. "What's left of them." She stepped inside, and Frank closed the door behind her, sliding the iron bar back into place. But for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't keeping the world out. It was keeping these women in, safe. Inside, his small living room transformed instantly. The couch became a triage station. The dining table, cleared with one sweep of a soldier's arm, became a tactical planning surface. The silence that had been Frank's only companion for half a decade shattered under the sound of boots on hardwood, hushed tactical communications, and the soft whimpers of an exhausted infant. Frank moved with military precision, gathering medical supplies, blankets, heating water. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He assessed, prioritized, acted. 2 women with field medicine training were already tending to the wounded. Another had positioned herself at the rear window, establishing a watch. The rest moved in coordinated patterns, securing the space, creating defensive positions from his furniture. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. The choreography of trained soldiers operating on instinct and discipline. Captain Ramirez stood in the center of it all, issuing quiet commands, her authority absolute despite her exhaustion. When she turned to Frank, her eyes held a question he understood implicitly. "Can we trust you? You don't know what you've just stepped into," she said, voice low enough that only he could hear. Frank's response came without hesitation. "Ma'am, I stopped knowing what I was in the day the world stopped knocking on my door." Something in her posture shifted, not relaxation, but recognition. She nodded once, then turned back to her team. "Daniels, secure the perimeter. Torres, communications check. Martinez, inventory supplies. Johnson, medical status." Frank watched the precision of her command, the immediate responses of her team. These weren't just any soldiers. These were elite operators, Rangers if their insignia was to be believed, and Rangers didn't run without reason. His attention shifted to the young woman with the baby. She had settled into the corner of the room, back to the wall, eyes constantly moving between the child and the doors. Tactical awareness even in her obvious exhaustion. The infant had quieted, somewhat small face pressed against her chest. "That yours?" Frank asked, his voice gentler than he'd intended. She looked up startled, then shook her head. "No, sir. Oh, we found her. Village near the border. Her mother..." She swallowed hard. "Her mother didn't make it." Frank didn't press further. Instead, he turned his attention back to Ramirez, who had spread a map across his table, waiting the corners with his coffee mug, a rock from the fireplace, and her own combat knife. "What's your situation, Captain?" he asked, military precision returning to his voice. Maria looked up, studying him for a moment before answering. "Compromised, outnumbered, tracked." She gestured to the map, a topographical rendering of the region. "We're here, I assume." Her finger tapped a location. Frank nodded. 30 miles from the nearest paved road, 40 from town. "Good, that buys us time." She straightened, rolling her shoulders to release tension. "Mr. Harmon, Frank." "Frank," she held his gaze. "I need to know your background, not what you did before I can make educated guesses based on how you fortified this place. I need to know your capabilities now." Frank considered the question, then moved to the closet beneath the stairs. He opened it, revealing a space that hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside hung a faded camouflage jacket, the name Harmon still visible on the patch. Below it sat a metal trunk. He dragged it out and flipped it open. Inside, tactical gear, communication equipment, medical supplies that would put most emergency rooms to shame, and beneath them, an array of weapons components. 5th Special Forces Group, Green Berets, team leader for 8 years, 4 deployments to Afghanistan, 3 to Iraq. Specialized in demolitions, field medicine, and indigenous force training. His voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of pride or embellishment. Honorable discharge in 2017. Maria nodded, absorbing the information without surprise. "And now I'm just a rancher who doesn't like company." He closed the trunk. "But I still remember how to fight." For the first time, a ghost of a smile crossed her face. Good, because I think we're going to need it. Frank turned to the young woman with the baby. What's your name, soldier? Sarah Collins, sir. Private first class. How old are you, Sarah? 19, sir. 19. Younger than he'd been on his first deployment. Young enough to be his daughter if he'd started a family earlier. Frank nodded toward the baby. And that little one, Sarah looked down at the bundle in her arms. We've been calling her Hope, sir. Seemed fitting. Hope. Frank felt something shift inside him, a foundation stone disturbed after years of careful stillness. Captain, he said, turning back to Maria, I think it's time you told me exactly what kind of trouble followed you to my door. Maria straightened military bearing, returning despite her fatigue. My team was attached to a classified mission near the border. Humanitarian logistics was the official designation, but the orders changed. Her jaw tightened. Our commanding officer, Colonel Wallace, redirected us to a village that wasn't on any map. No hostiles present, just civilians, farmers, families. She paused, the weight of memory visible in her eyes. The order was to eliminate all residents and burn the settlement. No witnesses, no record. When we refused and attempted to report up the chain of command, we were designated as non-compliant. 48 hours later, a retrieval order was issued. Frank's expression hardened. Retrieval. Military speak for bring them in or bury them where they fall. Maria nodded once. We've been running for 2 days, lost contact with our support network. And when we realized no one was coming to help us, we knew we'd become a liability they couldn't afford to let live. The fire cracked in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny defiant stars. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of tempest was brewing. And you came here, Frank said. Not a question. We needed somewhere defensible, Maria replied. Somewhere off-grid. She hesitated, then added, and someone who understood what it means when your own people turn against you. Frank absorbed this, the tactical implications rolling through his mind with practiced efficiency. They'll track you, find me. Yes. If they do, they won't ask questions. They'll assume I'm harboring fugitives, enemy combatants. Maria met his gaze steadily. You've been hiding from the world for 5 years, but you don't strike me as a man who's forgotten what's worth fighting for. The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a recognition. Frank looked around at the women who had invaded his sanctuary, soldiers who had chosen conscience over orders, morality over mission, who had rescued a child at the cost of their own safety. He hadn't fought for anything in 5 years, not since the courtroom, not since losing Anna. How much time do we have? He asked finally. If they're tracking us conventionally, maybe until morning, Maria answered. If they've deployed advanced assets, drones, thermal imaging, less. Frank nodded, decision made. Then we work fast. He turned to the trunk, opened it again, and began removing equipment. First priority, communications. We need to get your story out before they can contain it. Second, defensive preparations. Third, medical and supply inventory. He looked up at Maria and for the first time in years felt the familiar weight of purpose settle across his shoulders. Captain Ramirez, it seems your war has found its way to my doorstep. Let's make sure we're ready when it gets here. Outside, the storm continued to rage, masking the sounds of 12 people preparing for battle. But beneath the thunder and rain, another sound emerged, faint at first, then growing stronger. Frank Harmon's voice giving orders, making plans, coming alive again, in the language of war he'd tried so hard to forget. The night deepened as Frank and Maria's team transformed the ranch into a defensive position. Every soldier found their purpose, despite exhaustion. 2 established a perimeter watch from the upstairs windows. Another, a tall woman with a sergeant's stripes named Torres, began assembling a communications array from components in Frank's trunk. A stocky, red-haired corporal named Martinez converted the kitchen table into a field hospital, organizing medical supplies with practiced efficiency. Frank moved among them, providing equipment guidance, his own expertise integrating seamlessly with theirs. For the first time in years, his isolation felt like a liability rather than a refuge. In the corner, Sarah had finally gotten the baby to sleep, tucked in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a dresser drawer and blankets. As she straightened, Frank approached, offering a steaming mug. Tea, he said simply. You should drink something warm. She accepted it with a grateful nod. Thank you, sir. How long have you been with the unit? He asked, keeping his voice low. 8 months, sir. This was my first deployment. She looked down at the sleeping infant. Not how I imagined it would go. Frank studied her, so young yet already carrying the weight of impossible choices. The village. Tell me about it. Sarah's hands tightened around the mug. Small place, maybe 30 structures. Families mostly. When we arrived, they thought we were there to help. They offered us food. Her voice faltered. Colonel Wallace ordered us to secure the perimeter. That's when Captain Ramirez realized something was wrong. The mission brief didn't match what we were seeing. And the baby, Abraham, her mother ran to us when the first shots were fired, not ours, the advance team's. She thrust the baby into my arms, then Sarah swallowed hard. She was hit, didn't make it. I couldn't just leave her child there. Frank nodded understanding. In war, sometimes the only humanity left was in such small, desperate acts of mercy. You did right, soldier, he said quietly. Across the room, Maria was studying the topographical map marking positions with a pencil. Frank joined her, noting the precision of her tactical assessments. You've marked 4 approach vectors, he observed. She nodded without looking up. Most likely routes based on terrain and cover. If it were me leading the pursuit, I'd come in from the northwest ridge, best visibility, stable ground for vehicles. I agree, Frank tapped the map. There's a dry creek bed here, runs to within half a mile of the property. Natural channel for a flanking maneuver. Maria looked up, a glint of professional appreciation in her eyes. You've thought about how to defend this place before. I've had 5 years to think about it. Frank's voice was matter of fact. Never expected to be defending it against American forces, though. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the storm outside and the soft movements of soldiers preparing for conflict. Finally, Maria asked the question that hung unspoken in the air. Why did you let us in? Frank didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel still facing the wall. Because 5 years ago, I couldn't protect the people who mattered most. Maybe tonight I can do better. Maria followed his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. Family, wife, car accident, daughter taken by the courts. The words came out clipped, each one a wound reopened. I was deemed unstable. PTSD. Judge said I needed treatment before I could be trusted with her. Did you get it? The treatment, Frank shook his head, seemed pointless. You can't fix what war does to a man. You just learn to carry it. Maria's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Maybe, or maybe you learn to put it down. Before Frank could respond, Torres approached from the communications station. Captain, the encrypted channel is active. We're ready to broadcast. Maria nodded. Good work. She turned back to Frank. This is our best chance to get the story out before they can control the narrative. If the right people hear it, it won't stop them from coming, Frank said. But it might make them think twice about what happens when they get here. Maria moved toward the communications setup, then paused, looking back at Frank. You know what happens next, don't you? Once we broadcast, they'll accelerate. They'll come with everything they have. Frank checked his sidearm, a soldier's habit returning with practiced ease. Then we make sure it costs them more than they're willing to pay. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening to a gentle patter. Soon there would be no natural cover for their movements, no masking of sound or thermal signatures. Whatever was coming would find them exposed, 11 exhausted women, 1 man, and an infant making their stand in a ranch house in the middle of nowhere. But as Frank watched Maria prepare her transmission, her voice clear and authoritative, despite everything she'd endured, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Purpose. Later that night, Frank stood on the porch alone, scanning the darkness with practiced eyes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean, stars sharp and clear in the vastness above. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and distant sage, familiar scents that had once been the backdrop to his solitude. Now they were the prelude to conflict. The door creaked open behind him. Maria stepped out, her movements quieter than most would manage on the old wooden boards. She cleaned up her face free of mud, dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Even in fatigue, her bearing remained unmistakably that of a commander. Couldn't sleep, she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Didn't try him. Frank continued scanning the horizon. Your team. Resting in shifts. Torres is on watch. She moved to stand beside him, her presence oddly familiar despite their brief acquaintance. You have good instincts. Trained, not instinctive. Both, I think. She studied him in the moonlight. Green berets don't just happen. Neither do fortified ranches in the middle of nowhere. Frank almost smiled, a rusty, unpracticed expression. Fair assessment as... They stood in silence for a moment, two soldiers accustomed to the quiet before battle. Finally, Maria spoke again. Your daughter, what's her name? The question caught him off guard. Personal queries weren't part of tactical preparation. Yet something in Maria's tone suggested understanding rather than mere curiosity. Anna, he said after a moment. She's 10 now, lives in San Antonio with your aunt. You speak to her, Frank shook his head. Court said I needed supervised visitation after treatment. I never went, so... He let the sentence trail off. Maria nodded, accepting the explanation without judgment. My father was Special Forces, Vietnam. Never talked about it, but it lived in him like a ghost. Some nights he'd patrol the house perimeter until dawn. Frank looked at her, recognizing the shared understanding that came only from living in the shadow of war's aftermath. Did he find his way back, he asked. Mostly, enough to be present. She turned to face him fully. It's never too late, you know, to try. Before Frank could respond, a soft, alert tone came from the radio clipped to Maria's belt. She raised it to her ear, listening intently, her expression hardening. Understood. Maintain position. She lowered the radio, turning to Frank. Movement at the northern perimeter. Still distant, but approaching. All personal matters vanished, instantly replaced by combat readiness. Frank's mind shifted to tactical assessment options, defensive positions. How many single vehicle? Could be scouts. Frank nodded. If it were a full assault, they'd bring more. Agreed. They're testing our awareness, our response capabilities. Then let's give them nothing to report. Frank moved toward the door. No lights, no movement outside. Let them think we're sleeping. Maria followed her own tactical mind, clearly running parallel calculations. If they're using thermal imaging, west side of the house has a cold cellar, insulated. It'll mask heat signatures. Frank paused at the doorway. But if they're scouts, they won't just be looking. They'll be placing surveillance, motion sensors, directional microphones. We need to know what they're deploying without revealing that we know. Maria's mind worked through the problem. A distraction? Frank considered, then nodded toward the barn. I've got feral cats that come around sometimes. They trigger motion sensors, knock things over. Natural, not suspicious. A small smile touched Maria's lips, appreciation for tactical thinking. Release the cats, then watch the watchers. Exactly. They re-entered the house where several of Maria's team were already alert, responding to the same radio call. Frank moved among them with quiet authority, issuing instructions, his voice low but commanding. For a moment, it was as if the last 5 years had never happened. He was back in his element, leading a team through hostile territory. As he outlined the plan to a sergeant named Johnson, he caught Maria watching him, something unreadable in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of what she'd suspected, that beneath the isolation and grief, the soldier in Frank Harmon had never truly gone away. He'd just been waiting for a war worth fighting. By 3 a.m., the scouts had come and gone, leaving behind exactly what Frank had predicted: surveillance devices planted at strategic points around the property. He and Torres had mapped their locations without disturbing them, giving Maria's team a clear picture of what they were facing. 4 motion sensors, 2 audio surveillance units, and something that looks like a cellular interceptor. Torres reported, pointing to marks on a hand-drawn map of the property. Professional equipment, military grade. Maria studied the pattern. They're establishing a perimeter, creating a surveillance net, which means the main force isn't far behind, Frank added. Dawn, most likely. Best visibility, rested troops. The leadership team, Frank, Maria, Torres, and a tactical specialist named Vasquez, gathered around the dining table, voices low, despite being out of range of the listening devices. We have 3 strategic advantages, Frank said, outlining their position. First, we know the terrain better than they do. Second, they don't know our defensive capabilities. Third, we've already broadcast the situation, which means someone out there is listening. And several disadvantages, Maria countered, not pessimistic, but realistic. We're outnumbered, likely outgunned and exhausted, plus a non-combatant to protect. She glanced towards Sarah and the baby. Frank nodded, acknowledging the assessment. So we leverage what we have. Use the terrain, create ambiguity about our strength, and buy time for the broadcast to reach the right ears. He moved to the trunk he'd brought out earlier, opening a side compartment that revealed a collection of hand-drawn maps and diagrams. I've spent 5 years mapping every approach, blind spot, and defensive position on this property. He spread them out on the table. There are tunnels beneath the barn dug during Prohibition. They lead to a ridge half a mile east. Escape route if needed. Maria studied the diagrams with professional appreciation. You've been preparing for something. Not this, Frank's voice was quiet, but preparation is preparation. As dawn approached, the small house hummed with controlled activity. Weapons were checked and distributed. Defensive positions established. Communications maintained. The baby was moved to the cellar. The most protected location was Sarah, and another soldier assigned to guard her. Frank stood at the east window watching the sky lighten almost imperceptibly. Beside him, Maria checked her rifle with practiced movements. Your team is good, he said. Disciplined, cohesive. They're the best, she replied, pride evident despite her fatigue. First female ranger unit, experimental program. We had to be twice as good to be considered half as effective. Frank nodded, understanding the reality of military prejudice. And now you're here fighting your own command structure because you refused an illegal order. Ironic, isn't it? Maria's voice held no bitterness, only wry acknowledgement. Trained to follow orders, court-martialed for following our conscience instead. A moment of silence passed between them, filled with the weight of decisions that had led them both to this moment. Her choice to defy orders, his choice to open his door after 5 years of isolation. If we survive this, Frank said quietly. What comes next for you? Maria chambered around in her rifle, the metallic sound crisp in the pre-dawn stillness. Justice, hopefully. For the village, for my team. She glanced at him. And you? What comes after for the man who's been hiding from the world? Frank didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel, still facing away. I don't know, he admitted finally, but for the first time in 5 years, I'm thinking there might be an after. The first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the landscape in pale gold. With it came the distant sound of engines, multiple vehicles approaching from the north, just as they had predicted. Frank's radio crackled. Johnson's voice tense but controlled. Contact, northern approach. 5 vehicles, heavy personnel. Maria's eyes met Frank's determination, replacing fatigue. This is it. Frank checked his weapon one final time, feeling the weight of it in his hands, familiar grounding. Stay alive, Captain. We've got stories to tell when this is over. For the first time, a genuine smile crossed Maria's face, brief but real. Likewise, Sergeant Harmon. Together they moved to their positions as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Outside, the Texas dawn continued to unfold, indifferent to the battle about to break its peace. But inside Lone Pine Ranch, 12 soldiers prepared to make their stand, not for country, not for orders, but for something more fundamental. The truth and the right to speak it. Retreat A. Next edit. The vehicles appeared over the northern ridge like predators emerging from morning mist. 5 unmarked black SUVs moving in tactical formation, maintaining precise distance, their approach measured and deliberate. No sirens, no flags, no identifiable markings. Just the unmistakable discipline of a military operation trying not to look like one. Frank observed them through high-powered binoculars from the barn loft, body perfectly still, breathing controlled. Years of combat had taught him to read an approaching force like others read weather patterns, and what he saw concerned him. These weren't local law enforcement or even standard military police. The spacing, the approach vectors, the careful positioning, this was a specialized tactical unit. 4 personnel per vehicle minimum, he murmured into the radio clipped to his collar. Heavy tactical gear, precision movement. These aren't regular MPs. Maria's voice came back instantly calm and focused. Task Force Phoenix, Wallace's private hunting party. 20 operators then. At least. Frank adjusted the binoculars, focusing on the lead vehicle. Through the windshield, he caught a glimpse of the driver crew-cut sunglasses despite the early hour communications gear visible at his ear. Professional, experienced, dangerous. They're slowing at the half-mile marker, Frank reported. Standard procedure establishing final positions before engagement. Copy, Maria responded. Hold position. Let them make the first move. Frank lowered the binoculars, his mind calculating distances, angles, timing. In the main house, Maria had positioned her team at strategic points, 2 at the rear covering the approach from the south, 3 upstairs with clear lines of sight to the northern ridge, 2 in the reinforced cellar with Sarah and the baby, the rest distributed to create overlapping fields of fire. 11 exhausted women against 20 elite operators. The odds were brutal, but Frank had faced worse in different ways with different stakes. The vehicle stopped in a semicircle formation at the edge of the property, engines still running. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing happened, a calculated psychological tactic letting tension build, allowing the targets to imagine what might come next. Frank had employed the same technique in Afghanistan. Finally, the passenger door of the lead SUV opened. A tall figure emerged, male, mid-50s, silver hair cropped close to his skull. Even at this distance, his bearing was unmistakable, a commander accustomed to instant obedience. He wore tactical gear over civilian clothes, the incongruity somehow making him more menacing rather than less. "Wallace," Frank murmured into the radio. "Confirmed," came Maria's terse reply. Colonel James Wallace surveyed the property with calculated precision, then raised a handheld radio to his mouth. Moments later, personnel emerged from the other vehicles, 16 men in total, moving with the coordinated precision of a unit that had operated together for years. No standard-issue weapons. These were customized, specialized, the kind not logged in official inventories. "They're deploying in standard containment formation," Frank observed. 2 teams of 4 moving to flank positions east and west. Main force holding center. "They'll call first," Maria predicted. "Try to get us to surrender without a fight. Less mess to clean up." "Copy that. Maintain radio discipline from now on. I'm moving to secondary position." Frank slipped down from the loft using a rope he'd installed years ago, landing silently on the packed earth of the barn floor. Through a narrow gap in the wooden slats, he watched as the tactical teams moved into position. Textbook military precision, each man knowing his role, his position, his objective. These weren't hired guns or military police following orders. These were true believers. Wallace's personal unit men who operated in the shadows of official sanction, handling the missions that couldn't exist on paper. Frank had seen such units before, had commanded men like them, had been one of them once. The barn door, left deliberately ajar, creaked slightly in the morning breeze. Frank positioned himself behind a stack of hay bales, rifle ready, but not yet aimed, waiting, watching. The discipline of patience that had kept him alive through 4 combat tours. Wallace's voice suddenly boomed across the property, amplified by a tactical megaphone. "Captain Maria Ramirez, this is Colonel James Wallace, United States Army Special Operations Command. You and your team are hereby ordered to surrender and remand yourselves to military custody immediately." Inside the house, Frank knew Maria would be weighing her options, calculating risks and opportunities. The broadcast they'd sent hours earlier was their best hope. If it had reached sympathetic ears in the chain of command, help might already be on the way. But until then, they needed to survive. Wallace's voice came again, harder now. "Captain Ramirez, you are harboring classified intelligence and are considered a threat to national security. Surrender now, and no lethal force will be used against you or your team." Frank's radio crackled softly. Maria's voice barely a whisper, no response. Let him keep talking. Smart. Every moment Wallace spent negotiating was another moment for their broadcast to reach the right people, another moment for help to mobilize. When no response came from the house, Wallace's tactics shifted. "To the civilian resident of this property, you are harboring fugitives from military justice. Open your doors and step outside with your hands visible. You will not be harmed." Frank almost smiled at that. Classic psychological division: separate the combatants, isolate the perceived weaker link. But Wallace had no way of knowing who he was dealing with. 2 minutes to comply, Wallace announced. After that, we enter with force. Frank adjusted his position slightly, focusing on the nearest tactical team. 4 operators moving in standard formation toward the western edge of the property. Their approach would bring them within 20 yards of the barn, within range. His radio hissed quietly. "Barn team, be advised," Maria whispered. "We hold position unless directly engaged. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. Copy. Frank replied, his voice barely audible. The 2-minute deadline expired in tense silence. Wallace made a sharp hand gesture, and his teams began to advance with practiced coordination. Weapons up, movement, disciplined eyes constantly scanning for threats. Frank held his position, controlling his breathing, feeling the familiar calm of combat readiness settle over him. 5 years of isolation fell away like a shed skin. The man in the barn wasn't Frank Harmon, grieving widower failed father. He was Sergeant First Class Harmon, Green Beret, combat veteran. A soldier who knew exactly what to do when the enemy approached. The first shot came not from Wallace's men, but from the house, a single precise round that kicked up dirt 3 feet in front of the advancing team leader. A warning shot expertly placed. Everything stopped. The tactical teams froze, weapons raised but not yet firing. Wallace's expression darkened. That was your only warning, Maria's voice rang out from the house, clear and authoritative. The next one won't miss, Wallace raised his radio again, but before he could speak, Maria continued. Colonel Wallace, you are pursuing American soldiers who refused an illegal order to massacre civilians. We have documented evidence of your directives and have already transmitted it to multiple secure channels. Stand down now. A tense silence followed. Frank could see the calculation in Wallace's posture, the rapid assessment of changed circumstances. The man hadn't expected such direct confrontation, hadn't expected his crimes to be named so explicitly, so publicly. You are delusional, Captain, Wallace shouted back. Your team suffered combat stress and misinterpreted standard tactical directives. Surrender now and you'll receive proper medical evaluation. It was a clever pivot, reframing their defiance as mental instability, their testimony as delusion, a narrative that would be easy to sell to a military board more concerned with order than justice. Maria didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice carried a steel that even Frank, who barely knew her, recognized as unbreakable. We have body cam footage, Colonel. Time-stamped, geotagged, your exact words. Your exact orders. Verified and transmitted. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Wallace's face, visible even at this distance. He turned to confer with a subordinate, their conversation tense but inaudible. Frank used the moment to update his tactical assessment. Wallace now faced a more complex problem than simply retrieving rogue operators. If Maria's claims were true, and Frank had no reason to doubt them, then the colonel's priority would shift from capture to containment, eliminating witnesses, retrieving evidence, controlling the narrative, which made the situation exponentially more dangerous. Wallace seemed to reach the same conclusion. He turned back toward the house, his posture shifting subtly. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened, all pretense of negotiation gone. Final warning, surrender immediately or we will use lethal force. Frank tensed, recognizing the transition from talk to action. His finger moved to the trigger of his rifle, selecting the team leader of the nearest tactical unit as his primary target. Maria's voice came over the radio, a bare whisper. All positions? On my mark. Wallace raised his hand, preparing to give the signal to advance. Mark. The morning erupted in coordinated gunfire from the house, not wild or panicked, but precise, targeted. The tactical teams dove for cover, returning fire with professional discipline. Within seconds, the peaceful Texas dawn transformed into a combat zone, the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the landscape. Frank remained motionless, watching the nearest team regroup behind a natural berm 30 yards from the barn. They moved with the synchronization of extensive training, 2 providing covering fire while 2 advanced in short tactical bursts. He let them come. 20 yards, 15, 10. The team leader raised his hand, signaling a pause to reassess. That's when Frank took his shot, one clean round that caught the man in the tactical vest, the impact throwing him backward without penetrating. Before the others could locate the source, Frank had already shifted position, moving silently to a prepared fallback point inside the barn. The tactical response was immediate and overwhelming. Concentrated fire directed at his previous position, shredding the hay bales where he'd been moments before. Frank used their distraction to target the second operator, another non-lethal shot to the leg that took him out of the fight without killing him. 2 down, 2 active, and now they knew they were being flanked from the barn. Eastern approach compromised, came a terse report over Frank's radio, Johnson's voice. 2 hostiles, advancing under cover. Roger, Maria responded. Torres shift to east support. The tactical exchange continued professional and measured on both sides. No wasted words, no panic. Just soldiers executing their training on an underfire. Frank focused on his immediate threat, the two remaining operators now using the barn itself as cover, trying to locate his position. He'd prepared for this years ago, installing false walls, concealed firing ports, multiple exit points. What looked like a simple structure from outside was a tactical maze within. He moved silently to a secondary position, using a narrow crawl space above the horse stalls to flank the operators as they entered the main door. They were good moving in tandem, covering each other's blind spots, communicating with hand signals. But they were entering Frank's territory, a battlefield he'd designed specifically for defense. The first operator passed beneath him, weapons sweeping methodically across potential hiding spots. Frank waited for the second to follow, then dropped a flashbang grenade, not lethal but disorienting. The concussive blast in the enclosed space was devastating, leaving both men temporarily blinded and disoriented. Frank descended swiftly, disarming them with practiced efficiency. Zip ties secured their wrists and ankles, and a strip of duct tape across their mouths prevented any calls for assistance. Within 30 seconds, both operators were neutralized alive, but contained. West Barns secure, he reported quietly. 2 packages contained. Copy, Maria acknowledged. Main house holding. Northern team pushed back to vehicles. Outside, the firefight continued, but Frank noticed a change in the pattern of engagement. Wallace's teams were no longer advancing. Their fire had become defensive rather than offensive, maintaining position rather than pushing forward. Something had changed in their tactical calculation. Frank moved to the barn's eastern window using a small mirror to observe without exposing himself. What he saw confirmed his suspicion. Wallace was on his radio expression tense, gesturing sharply. At the same time, 2 of the SUVs were being repositioned, creating a defensive perimeter rather than an assault formation. They're pulling back, Frank reported. Something spooked them. Our broadcast, Maria suggested. Maybe it reaches someone with authority. Maybe, Frank agreed, though his tactical instincts suggested caution. Or they're regrouping for a different approach. Wallace shouted orders to his teams, who began executing a controlled withdrawal, professional, disciplined, maintaining covering fire as they retreated to the vehicles. Within minutes, 4 of the 5 SUVs had pulled back beyond the ridge, leaving only Wallace and a small security detail at the original position. The sudden reduction in fire allowed Frank to hear something else, a distant sound that hadn't been there before. Rotors, helicopter rotors approaching from the southeast. Aircraft inbound, he reported, moving quickly to a better observation position. Single helicopter, southeastern approach. Ours or theirs? Maria asked the question that mattered most. Frank trained his binoculars on the approaching aircraft, now visible as a black dot against the morning sky. As it drew closer, the profile became clear. Not a military attack helicopter, but a civilian model. More significantly, the markings on its side were unmistakable Federal. Frank reported, relief evident despite his professional detachment. Looks like your broadcast found the right ears. The helicopter approached rapidly, hovering briefly over the property before setting down in the open field east of the house. Even from this distance, Frank could see Wallace's posture stiffen, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before stopping, a soldier's reflexive response to a threat quickly controlled. 3 figures emerged from the helicopter, wearing the distinctive windbreakers of federal agents. They approached Wallace with measured strides, professional but unmistakably authoritative. Though too distant to hear the exchange, the body language told the story. Wallace was being confronted by a higher authority, one he hadn't anticipated. Captain Frank radioed, federal agents on site engaging with Wallace. Maintain defensive positions until we confirm their intentions. Copy that, Maria responded. No one moves until we're certain. Frank watched as Wallace gesticulated angrily, pointing toward the house, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. But the lead federal agent, a woman with short blonde hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, seemed unmoved. She produced documents, held them up for Wallace to see, her posture unyielding. Whatever was in those papers changed the equation. Wallace's shoulders slumped slightly, barely perceptible, but to Frank's trained eye a clear sign of defeat. After a tense exchange, Wallace and his remaining team returned to their vehicle while the federal agents approached the house. Frank moved quickly, exiting the barn through a concealed rear door and making his way to the house using cover and concealment. 5 years of isolation hadn't dulled his tactical movement skills. He entered through the kitchen door, finding Maria and her team still in defensive positions, weapons ready but not aimed. Federal agents approaching the front door, Frank reported. Wallace is standing down but remains on site. Maria nodded, her expression a complex mixture of relief and caution. Johnson Vasquez maintained rear security. Torres with me. Together, Maria, Torres, and Frank moved to the front of the house. Maria straightened her uniform as best she could, wiping a smudge of dirt from her face, a soldier's instinctive preparation to face authority. The knock, when it came, was firm, but not aggressive. Maria took a deep breath, then opened the door, standing tall despite her exhaustion. The blonde agent showed her credentials. Captain Ramirez, Special Agent Diana Mitchell, FBI. We received your transmission and have been authorized to intervene. Are you and your team secure? Maria's professional composure held, though Frank could see the slight tremor in her hand relief after days of constant vigilance. Yes, ma'am. 11 personnel, plus 1 civilian non-combatant. Minor injuries only. Agent Mitchell nodded, then glanced at Frank, assessing him with the quick, comprehensive gaze of someone trained to evaluate threats. And you are Frank Harmon. This is my property. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Sergeant First Class Harmon, Green Berets. Frank nodded, surprised at being identified. Your name was in Captain Ramirez's transmission, Mitchell explained. Your military record is significant. Before Frank could respond, Mitchell continued, addressing both of them. Colonel Wallace is being detained pending investigation. His team has been ordered to stand down. We've been authorized to secure your testimony and evidence regarding the alleged illegal orders and subsequent pursuit. Alleged. Maria's voice hardened slightly. Mitchell's expression softened, professional distance giving way to genuine empathy. Protocol language, Captain. Your transmission included enough preliminary evidence to warrant immediate intervention. The body cam footage you mentioned will be crucial to the full investigation. For the first time in days, something like hope crossed Maria's face. So you believe us? The FBI goes where the evidence leads, Mitchell replied diplomatically. But yes, personally I believe you. Now let's get your team secured and debriefed. As Mitchell spoke with Maria about next steps, Frank moved to the window, watching as Wallace was escorted to a separate vehicle that had arrived behind the helicopter. The colonel's face was a mask of controlled rage, his eyes finding the house, finding Frank's window, with the cold calculation of a predator marking prey for future reference. Frank had seen that look before in the eyes of enemy combatants who survived to fight another day. It wasn't surrender, it was postponement. Mitchell rejoined them, noting Frank's vigilance. He's being taken to a secure federal facility for questioning. Your team's safety is now our priority, Captain Ramirez. Maria nodded, professional relief evident in her posture. Thank you, Agent Mitchell. My team will cooperate fully with your investigation. As the two women discussed logistics for debriefing and evidence processing, Frank maintained his watch at the window. Wallace's vehicle departed, followed by the remaining SUVs, a convoy of shadows retreating into the morning light. But even as they disappeared over the ridge, Frank's combat instincts remained alert. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Wallace had powerful connections, resources, protection from above, the kind of man who didn't stay contained for long. Maria seemed to sense his thoughts appearing beside him at the window. You think he'll be back? It wasn't a question. Frank nodded slightly. Men like Wallace don't surrender. They regroup. Maria's expression hardened with grim understanding. Then we'd better make sure our evidence is bulletproof. She hesitated, then added, Thank you for taking us in, for fighting alongside us. Frank looked at her, a woman who had risked everything for what was right, who had led her team through impossible odds with unwavering resolve. In another life, under different circumstances, he would have been proud to serve under her command. You gave me something I haven't had in 5 years, Captain, he said quietly. What's that, a purpose worth fighting for? For a moment, something passed between them, not romantic, not even particularly personal. The silent recognition of kindred spirits. Soldiers who understood the weight of command, the burden of conscience, the cost of doing what's right when orders demand otherwise. Then the moment passed, and they returned to the practical matters at hand, securing the property, tending to the wounded, preparing for debriefing. The immediate danger had passed, but both of them knew from hard experience that safety was always conditional, always temporary, especially when the enemy wore the same uniform you once did. By mid-afternoon, Lone Pine Ranch had transformed from battleground to investigation site. FBI agents documented evidence, photographed damage, collected shell casings, and conducted preliminary interviews with Maria's team. Medical personnel treated minor injuries, a graze wound on Johnson's arm, a sprained ankle Torres had sustained during the firefight, the various cuts and bruises of combat. Frank moved among them like a ghost present, but somehow separate a man caught between his isolation and his reawakened purpose. He provided what was needed space for interviews, supplies, information about the property, but maintained a careful distance from the federal process unfolding in his home. He found Sarah in the kitchen, the baby asleep in her arms. Despite everything, the infant looked peaceful, unaware of the violence that had nearly consumed them all. She slept through most of it, Sarah said, noticing Frank's gaze. Even the gunfire. Exhaustion, I guess. Frank nodded, understanding all too well how the body prioritized survival. The doctors check her. Yes, sir, she's dehydrated, but otherwise healthy. Sarah adjusted the blanket around the sleeping child. They want to take her child services protocols. Something in Frank's chest tightened. And you? Sarah looked down, her young face showing an age beyond her years. I told them I want to stay with her, at least until... She trailed off, the complexity of her request overwhelming her. Until you know she's safe. Frank finished for her. Sarah nodded, grateful for the understanding. Frank had seen this before, the attachments formed in combat, the fierce protectiveness that emerged when soldiers found something innocent to shield amid the chaos of war. He'd experienced it himself in Afghanistan, a village child who'd followed him for days after they'd secured her town, a small hand slipping trustingly into his every time he stopped moving. I'll speak with Agent Mitchell, he said, see what can be arranged. Thank you, sir. Sarah's voice was small but steady. In the living room, Maria was finishing her formal statement, her posture military straight despite her exhaustion. Frank waited until she was done, then approached as she rose from the table. How's it going? He asked quietly. Thoroughly, she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Agent Mitchell is, detailed. Frank nodded toward the kitchen. Sarah's concerned about the baby, want us to stay with her through the process. Maria's expression softened. I'll support her request officially. My command authority isn't worth much right now, but it might help. It will, Frank assured her. Your team respects you. That counts for something even with the feds. They moved to the porch, seeking a moment of privacy amid the controlled chaos inside. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, highlighting the scars of the morning's battle, splintered wood bullet holes that churned earth where vehicles had maneuvered. You're home, Maria said quietly. I'm sorry about the damage. Frank shrugged. Buildings can be repaired. They stood in comfortable silence, two soldiers decompressing after combat, a ritual as old as war itself. Finally, Maria spoke again. They're taking us to a secure federal facility in San Antonio tonight. Protective custody while the investigation proceeds. She hesitated. Wallace has connections, powerful ones. This won't be as straightforward as Agent Mitchell hopes. Frank had assumed as much. Men like Wallace didn't operate without protection from above generals. Politicians, intelligence officials, who found his methods useful until they became liabilities. What will you do after, he asked. Maria considered the question. Depends on how this plays out. Best case, we're vindicated. Wallace faces charges, we return to duty. She shook her head slightly. Worst case, dishonorable discharges, possible charges of our own blacklisted from service. And the truth about the village. That's what matters most, Maria said firmly. Whatever happens to us, people need to know what was ordered, what we refused to do. Frank nodded, understanding. In war, justice was often sacrificed for expedience, truth buried beneath classified reports and redacted testimonies. But occasionally, rarely, the light broke through. And you, Maria asked, what happens to Frank Harmon after we leave? It was a question he hadn't considered, had deliberately avoided considering. For 5 years, his life had been defined by absence, by withdrawal, by the careful maintenance of isolation. Now, in the span of 24 hours, that carefully constructed solitude had been shattered. I don't know, he admitted. Haven't thought that far ahead. Ahoy, Maria studied him, her gaze penetrating, but not judgmental. 5 years is a long time to be alone. Wasn't alone, Frank corrected automatically. I had my ghosts. And now I have bullet holes in my walls and federal agents in my kitchen. The attempt at humor felt rusty, unpracticed. Maria smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, revealing the woman beneath the soldier. Could be worse. Could be Wallace's team instead. Frank almost smiled back, almost. True enough. Before they could continue, Agent Mitchell approached from the house, her expression professionally neutral. Captain Ramirez, we're ready to transport your team to the secure facility. Transport will arrive in 30 minutes. Maria nodded. Thank you, Agent Mitchell. We'll be ready. Mitchell turned to Frank. Mr. Harmon, we'll need you to come in as well. Your testimony as a witness is crucial to establishing the timeline and circumstances. Frank tensed slightly, his instinct for independence reasserting itself. My statement isn't enough. I'm afraid not, Mitchell replied. Your military background makes you a highly credible witness. The fact that you had no prior connection to Captain Ramirez or her team strengthens their case significantly. Frank understood the logic, but the thought of leaving his property, of re-entering the world he deliberately left behind, sent a cold tension through his body. Mitchell seemed to sense his reluctance. It would only be for a few days, she added, and it could make the difference for these women. Frank looked at Maria, saw in her eyes both understanding of his hesitation and hope for his agreement. These women had risked everything to do what was right. Could he do any less? When do we leave? He asked, decision made. Mitchell's professional mask slipped slightly, showing approval. Same transport as Captain Ramirez's team. I'll have an agent help you pack essentials. As Mitchell returned to the house, Maria touched Frank's arm lightly, a soldier's gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Thank you. Frank nodded once, already calculating what he needed to do before departure: secure the property, activate the remote surveillance system he had installed years ago, pack the few things that mattered. As he turned to begin preparations, Maria spoke again, her voice thoughtful. You know, when we were running trying to find somewhere safe, one of my team mentioned a story she'd heard in training about a Green Beret who'd built a fortress in the Texas wilderness. A man who'd stood his ground in Afghanistan when others retreated, who'd once held a village against overwhelming odds because he'd given his word to protect its people. She met his gaze steadily. I thought it was just a story, the kind soldiers tell to inspire each other. Frank felt something shift inside him, the uncomfortable recognition of being seen, of having his carefully constructed anonymity penetrated. There are lots of stories in the military, most of them exaggerated. Maybe, Maria conceded, but we found our way here anyway. To the one place, the one person who could understand what it means to choose conscience over orders. She held his gaze. Perhaps some stories exist because they need to be true. Before Frank could respond, Torres called from the doorway, requiring Maria's attention for final preparations. She left him standing on the porch, surrounded by the scars of battle and the unexpected weight of being remembered, of being a story told by soldiers. He'd never met a symbol of something he wasn't sure he still believed in. Inside, the house continued its transformation from battlefield to staging area, Maria's team gathering their few possessions, federal agents cataloging final evidence. Frank moved among them, a solitary figure, preparing to leave the solitude he'd built with such care. As he packed a small bag with essentials, clothes, medications, his military ID buried unused for years in a drawer, he paused at the photograph on the mantel, still facing away from the room. For the first time in 5 years, he turned it around, allowing Rebecca's smile and his innocent wave to face the light again. I'm leaving for a while, he told them quietly, but you'll be back. And for the first time in 5 years, it felt like a promise rather than a retreat. Outside, the helicopter returned, followed by 2 black SUVs, federal transport, not Wallace's team. As Maria's soldiers filed out of the house, their discipline evident, even in exhaustion, Frank found himself watching them with a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in their courage, respect for their integrity, and something else, something he had thought long buried under grief and isolation, a sense of belonging. Maria approached as he locked the front door, her few possessions in a small pack over her shoulder. Ready. Frank surveyed his home one last time, the bullet-scarred walls, the broken windows, the evidence of battle. 5 years of perfect isolation shattered in a single day. Yeah, he said finally, I'm ready. Together they walked toward the waiting vehicles, leaving behind the fortress that had sheltered them all when it mattered most. As they moved across the yard, Frank noticed something unexpected, a small green shoot emerging from the soil near the porch steps. A seedling from the lone pine that gave his ranch its name, taking root in ground disturbed by conflict. New life emerging from battle-scarred earth. Frank didn't consider himself a man who looked for signs or meanings in random events. But as he boarded the helicopter that would carry him back to the world, he couldn't help but think that perhaps, like that seedling, something new was beginning for him as well. Something that had taken root in the very moment he'd opened his door to a group of soldiers with nowhere else to go. Retrie next edit. The federal facility outside San Antonio resembled a corporate retreat more than a military installation. A low-profile complex of modern buildings nestled among oak trees, its security measures subtle but comprehensive. No signs identified its purpose. No flags flew from its poles. Only the precisely positioned cameras, the reinforced entry points, and the armed personnel in unmarked tactical gear suggested its true function. Frank sat alone in a sparse interview room, the sterile environment a stark contrast to his weathered ranch house. The polished table, the ergonomic chair, the temperature-controlled air, all of it felt foreign after 5 years of dust and solitude. His hands, calloused from ranch work, seemed out of place against the sleek surface. 3 hours of detailed questioning had left him mentally drained but resolute. He'd provided his account with military precision. Times positions, tactical assessments, all delivered with the detached accuracy of a field report. No embellishment, no emotional coloring, just facts as he'd observed them. Now waiting for Agent Mitchell to return with additional questions, Frank found his mind drifting to Maria and her team, sequestered in other parts of the facility, providing their own testimonies. He wondered how Sarah was holding up, if she'd been allowed to stay with the baby, if Torres had received proper medical attention for her injured leg. The door opened and Agent Mitchell entered, a tablet in one hand, a fresh cup of coffee in the other. She placed the coffee in front of Frank, a small courtesy he hadn't expected. "Thought you could use this," she said, taking the seat across from him. "You've been at this a while." Frank nodded his thanks, wrapping weathered fingers around the warm cup. "How much longer?" "For today we're done." Mitchell placed the tablet on the table. "Your statement corroborates Captain Ramirez's account on all major points." "That's significant, Mr. Harmon." "Sergeant," Frank corrected automatically, then paused, surprised at himself. He hadn't used his rank in years, had deliberately shed that identity when he'd retreated to Lone Pine. Mitchell noted the correction with a slight nod. "Sergeant Harmon, your military background adds considerable weight to your testimony, especially given your history." Something in her tone made Frank wary. "My history?" Mitchell tapped the tablet, bringing up a file. 3 bronze stars, 2 purple hearts, the Distinguished Service Cross for actions in Kandahar Province, 2007. She looked up. "You held a strategic village against a Taliban force 4 times your size for 38 hours until reinforcements arrived." Frank's jaw tightened. He didn't like being reminded of that mission, not because it had gone wrong, but because it had cost 3 of his men their lives. 3 letters he'd written to families explaining why their sons and husbands weren't coming home. "That's classified information," he said, voice flat. "Not to the FBI in a national security investigation." Mitchell's tone remained professional, but softened slightly. "The point is, your combat record and subsequent withdrawal from society make you an ideal witness in this case. You had no prior connection to Captain Ramirez or her team, no agenda, no reason to support their claims unless they were true." Frank understood the logic but didn't particularly appreciate being evaluated like a strategic asset. "When can I return to my ranch?" "Soon, a few more days at most." Mitchell closed the tablet. "In the meantime, you'll be provided accommodations here. Secure, comfortable, but I'm afraid you can't leave the facility until the initial investigation is complete." "Am I under arrest?" "No, protected custody." Mitchell's expression remained neutral. "Colonel Wallace has powerful friends, Sergeant Harmon. Until we've secured all evidence and testimonies, everyone involved needs to remain in a controlled environment." Frank didn't argue. He understood operational security, the need to control variables during sensitive investigations. And despite his instinctive desire to return to his isolation, he wouldn't leave until he knew Maria's team was safe, until their truth was secured. "What about the baby?" he asked. "And Private Collins?" A trace of genuine warmth crossed Mitchell's professional mask. Child Protective Service has temporary custody, but given the circumstances, we've arranged for Private Collins to remain with her under supervision. The child's well-being is a priority. Frank nodded, relieved. And Captain Ramirez's team being debriefed individually, then together as a unit. Medical care provided as needed. Mitchell paused. They're remarkable women, Sergeant. What they did refusing that order, documenting everything, maintaining unit cohesion, even while being hunted by their own command, it's unprecedented. Not unprecedented, Frank corrected quietly. Just rarely documented. Mitchell studied him, understanding dawning in her eyes. You've seen similar situations. Frank didn't respond directly. Some truths belong to the dead, to the missions that never made official reports, to the moral compromises buried under classification levels even the FBI couldn't easily access. Mitchell seemed to understand his silence. She gathered her materials and stood. An agent will show you to your quarters. If you need anything, there's a secure line in your room. As she reached the door, Frank spoke again. Wallace, what's happening with him? Mitchell turned, her expression carefully controlled. Colonel Wallace is being questioned at a separate facility. Beyond that, I can't comment on an ongoing investigation. He won't break easily, Frank said, not a question, but an assessment. No, Mitchell agreed. Men like Wallace rarely do. After she left, Frank remained seated, hands wrapped around the cooling coffee. His thoughts turned to Wallace, a commander who'd ordered the massacre of civilians, then hunted down his own soldiers when they refused. Frank had encountered such men before, officers who believed their authority was absolute, who confused military necessity with personal power. Dangerous men, especially when cornered. An agent appeared to escort him to his assigned quarters, a small but functional room with a bed desk, private bathroom, and window overlooking a courtyard. Bare, impersonal, but secure. Frank surveyed it with the automatic tactical assessment of a soldier's single entry point window, too small for adult egress furnishings, bolted down camera, discreetly mounted in the ceiling corner. A comfortable cell dressed up as protection. He sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion. How long had it been since he'd slept 36 hours longer? The adrenaline of combat, the hypervigilance of tactical situations had kept him functioning, but now in the artificial safety of federal custody, his body was demanding rest. Yet sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept cycling through tactical assessments, contingency plans, threat evaluations. Old habits from combat zones reawakened by the events at Lone Pine. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Maria stood in the hallway accompanied by a female agent who maintained a respectful distance. Captain, Frank acknowledged, surprised by her presence. Sergeant. Maria's posture remained military straight despite evident fatigue. May I have a word? Frank stepped back, allowing her to enter. The agent remained in the hallway, a subtle reminder of their monitored status. Maria surveyed the room quickly, the same tactical assessment Frank had performed before turning to face him. She'd showered, changed into clean clothes provided by the facility, but exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. How's your team? Frank asked. Managing. Torres got proper medical attention for her leg. Johnson's arm was just a graze, healing clean. Maria's professional report couldn't quite mask her concern for her soldiers. Sarah's with the baby. They've set up a temporary nursery for them. Frank nodded, relieved. In the investigation ongoing, they've recovered our body cam footage, corroborated our accounts. She hesitated. But Wallace isn't without resources. 3 senators have already made inquiries about his detention. He's claiming we misinterpreted standing orders due to combat stress. Standard counter-narrative, Frank observed. Discredit the witnesses, reframe the evidence. Exactly. Maria's jaw tightened. We knew this wouldn't be simple. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 soldiers accustomed to the complexities of military justice, the way power protected itself, the uphill battle faced by those who challenged the chain of command. I wanted to thank you, Maria said finally, for testifying, for fighting alongside us. You didn't have to get involved. Frank shrugged slightly. Didn't really have a choice once you knocked on my door. There's always a choice. Maria's gaze was steady. You could have turned us away, could have surrendered us to Wallace when he arrived, could have protected yourself and your property. Not much of a choice, Frank replied. Not for anyone who's ever worn the uniform. Maria studied him, seeming to weigh something in her mind before speaking again. The mission in Kandahar, 2007, that was you, wasn't it? The village defense that's still taught at ranger school. Frank stiffened, uncomfortable with the recognition. That was a long time ago. Not so long. Maria moved to the window, looking out at the courtyard below. They teach it as a case study in moral courage under fire. How a special forces team chose to protect civilians despite direct orders to withdraw and abandon the village to enemy forces. The memory surfaced unbidden mud walls under mortar fire, his 12-man team, and 30 local fighters against a Taliban force of over 200. The radio crackling with commands to fall back to prioritize a high-value target elsewhere. His decision to stay to hold the line to keep his promise to the village elders. 3 men lost, 3 letters written, a commendation he'd never felt he deserved. We made a promise, he said simply. That's all. Maria turned back to him, understanding in her eyes. That's what I told my team when Wallace gave the order to eliminate the village. I said we made a promise when we took the oath to defend, not to murder. Something passed between them, then the unspoken recognition of shared values, of lines that couldn't be crossed, of promises kept at tremendous cost. Your team followed you, Frank observed. That says something important about your leadership. They're good soldiers, better than the system deserved. Pride and protectiveness mingled in her voice. Before Frank could respond, another knock came at the door. The agent in the hallway spoke through the panel. Captain Ramirez, your presence is requested for additional debriefing. Maria straightened, military bearing reasserting itself. We'll talk more later if that's all right. Frank nodded. I'll be here. After she left, Frank returned to the window, watching as dusk settled over the facility grounds. Beyond the perimeter fence, San Antonio's lights began to glow in the distance, a city he hadn't visited in 5 years, part of a world he'd deliberately left behind. A world that was now inexorably pulling him back into its orbit. That night, sleep eluded Frank despite his exhaustion. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet, the air too still. He'd grown accustomed to the sounds of his ranch, the wind through the rafters, the distant call of coyotes, the creak of weathered wood adjusting to temperature changes. Here in this sterile federal facility, the silence felt oppressive, unnatural. When he did drift off, his dreams were fragmented, shifting between memories and anxieties. Kandahar, 2007. The courtroom where he'd lost Anna. Wallace's cold, calculating eyes as he'd been led away. Rebecca's smile in the photograph he'd finally turned to face the light. He woke before dawn, body tense, mind alert, the ingrained response of a soldier in unfamiliar territory. For several minutes, he simply lay still, reorienting himself, remembering where he was and why. Then he rose, falling automatically into the physical routine that had sustained him through 4 combat tours, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, controlled breathing. The simple discipline of maintaining his body when his mind felt scattered. A soft knock interrupted his routine. Frank paused, glancing at the door with instinctive wariness. Dawn was barely breaking, too early for scheduled interviews or meals. Sergeant Harmon, a young agent's voice pitched low. Sorry to disturb you, sir, but Captain Ramirez requested your presence, if you're available. Frank pulled on a t-shirt, moving to the door. What's happened? The agent, barely 30, with the crisp efficiency of recent academy training, maintained a professional demeanor. Nothing urgent, sir. Captain Ramirez and her team are gathered in the East Conference Room. She thought you might want to join them. Curious, Frank followed the agent through the quiet hallways of the facility. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the windows with pale gold. Few personnel were visible at this hour: a skeleton security detail, a technician monitoring systems, a janitor buffing floors. The agent led him to a conference room at the end of a long corridor, then discreetly withdrew, maintaining position outside the door. When Frank entered, he found Maria's team seated around a large table, cups of coffee and half-eaten breakfast foods scattered among maps and notebooks. Maria looked up from where she stood at the head of the table, a slight smile crossing her face. Sergeant Harmon, thank you for joining us. Frank nodded, taking in the scene. Despite the early hour, all 11 women were present, alert, engaged in what appeared to be a tactical discussion. Maps of the border region were spread across the table, marked with notations and symbols familiar to any military planner. We're reviewing our mission data, Maria explained, gesturing to the materials. Correlating locations, timelines, witness accounts. building our case from the ground up. Frank understood immediately. These women weren't passively waiting for the federal investigation to proceed. They were conducting their own, ensuring nothing was missed. No detail overlooked. Soldiers taking control of what they could in a situation largely beyond their control. Thought you might have insights, Maria continued. Given your experience, it was more than a courtesy invitation, Frank realized. It was an acknowledgement of his expertise, his perspective as both outsider and ally. He moved to the table, scanning the maps with practiced eyes. What are we looking at? He asked, slipping naturally into the collaborative assessment mode of mission planning. Torres, her injured leg propped on a chair, pointed to a marked location near the border. This is where we received the original humanitarian mission brief. Standard operation medical supplies, food distribution, infrastructure, assessment. Johnson, the team's intelligence specialist, indicated another point 30 miles west. This is where we were redirected. New coordinates, new mission parameters. Wallace claimed intelligence had identified a high-value target in this village. But when we arrived, Maria continued, we found no evidence of insurgent activity, just civilians, farmers, families, children. Her voice remained steady, but Frank could hear the controlled anger beneath. That's when Wallace issued the new order. Clear the village. No witnesses. Frank studied the map, his tactical mind processing terrain distances, potential approach vectors. These are unincorporated borderlands, jurisdictional gray areas. Exactly, Torres confirmed. No local authority, minimal oversight, perfect for operations that need to stay off the books. But why this village? Frank asked the question that mattered most. What made it a target? The team exchanged glances, and Maria nodded to a young specialist named Diaz. Show him what you found. Diaz opened a laptop, turning it toward Frank. I was our geomapping specialist. Before each mission, I compiled terrain and infrastructure data. She pulled up satellite imagery of the region. This is the village 6 months ago. The image showed a small settlement, perhaps 30 structures, primitive irrigation systems surrounding agricultural plots. Nothing remarkable. And this, Diaz continued, is the same location 3 months ago. The new image revealed subtle but significant changes, expanded irrigation, new structures, roads being improved. Development, but nothing that would justify military intervention. Now look at the geological survey data. Diaz overlaid a color-coded map atop the satellite imagery. This region shows high concentrations of rare earth minerals, specifically lithium deposits consistent with those found in major battery production operations. Frank's eyes narrowed, understanding beginning to dawn. Strategic resources. Worth billions, Johnson added, especially with the current push toward electric vehicles and renewable energy storage. We think Wallace wasn't operating under official orders, Maria said quietly. We think he was contracted by private interests to clear the area for resource exploitation. No witnesses, no indigenous claims, no messy relocation issues. The implication was staggering: a senior military commander using American troops to commit atrocities for corporate interests. Frank had seen corruption in war zones, had encountered officers who blurred ethical lines, but this was different. This was calculated, premeditated evil disguised as military necessity. You have proof, he asked. Fragmentary, Maria admitted. Communications we intercepted, patterns of deployment, financial transfers we couldn't fully trace. But combined with the body cam footage, the village location, and the mineral surveys, she let the conclusion hang unspoken. Frank absorbed this understanding, the full weight of what these women had stumbled upon, and why Wallace had pursued them with such determination. This wasn't just about disobeyed orders or insubordination. This was about exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command and corporate power. The FBI knows this, he asked. We've shared our suspicions and supporting data, Maria confirmed. Agent Mitchell is pursuing those angles, but carefully. The political implications are significant. Frank nodded, understanding the delicate position of federal investigators when confronting potential corruption at this level. What can I do to help? Maria seemed relieved at the question, as if she'd been uncertain of his response. We need your perspective on Kandahar, on what happened when you defied direct orders to abandon the village. Frank stiffened slightly. He rarely spoke about that mission, even to other Special Forces operators. The cost had been too high, the memories too raw. Sensing his hesitation, Maria continued. The military will try to frame our actions as emotional irrational, driven by combat stress rather than moral clarity. Your experience provides a precedent, a case where defying orders was later recognized as the right decision. It strengthens our position. Frank looked around the table at these women elite soldiers who had risked everything to uphold the values their uniform represented, who continued to fight for truth even while under federal protection, who refused to let power and corruption override their oath. He owed them his honesty at the very least. Kandahar Province, May 2007. He began, his voice dropping into the measured cadence of a mission brief. My Team 12 Green Berets was embedded with local forces to secure a strategic valley. The village of Kala Gush was our central operating base. We'd been there 3 months, built relationships, trained a local defense force of about 30 fighters. The room grew quiet, the women recognizing the rare gift of a special forces operator sharing classified field experience. Taliban forces began massing in the region, 200 plus well-armed, coordinated. We requested reinforcement, but assets were committed elsewhere. Then we received direct orders to withdraw immediately to support a high-value target operation 50 miles east. Frank's gaze grew distant, seeing not the conference room, but the dusty command post where he'd received those orders. Withdrawal meant abandoning the village to Taliban forces who had explicitly threatened reprisals against any locals who cooperated with the American troops. We had intelligence indicating they planned to make an example of Kala Gush, public executions, structural destruction, complete elimination of resistance. He paused, the weight of memory evident in his posture. I made the call to stay, to defend the village against direct orders. My team backed me unanimously. His voice tightened slightly. We held for 38 hours, lost 3 men, but when reinforcements finally arrived, the village was intact, the civilians alive. Frank looked up, meeting Maria's gaze. The official report commended our actions. Medals were awarded. But unofficially, my career advancement ended that day. Command doesn't forget when you challenge the chain, even when they publicly acknowledge you were right. The parallels to Maria's situation were unmistakable. The moral choice versus the career consequences, the cost of standing by principles when orders demanded otherwise. What happened to the village? Torres asked quietly. It still stands, Frank replied. Last I heard, they named their school after Roberts, one of my men who didn't make it out. A somber silence fell over the room, each woman processing the story through the lens of their own recent experience. Finally, Maria spoke again. Would you be willing to include this in your official testimony, to draw the parallel explicitly? Frank considered the request. For years he'd kept the full truth of Kandahar buried, had spoken of it only in the most clinical official terms. To expose it now, to use his experience as a shield for these women, meant revisiting wounds he'd long tried to ignore. But looking at Maria's team, their determination, their unity, their unwavering commitment to truth, he found his decision wasn't difficult at all. Yes, he said simply, whatever helps your case. Relief and gratitude flickered across Maria's face. Thank you, Sergeant. The tactical discussion continued for another hour, Frank contributing insights on military procedure, chain of command vulnerabilities, the politics of classified operations. The women incorporated his perspective seamlessly, adjusting their approach, strengthening their position. As the session concluded and the team began to disperse for their scheduled debriefings, Sarah approached Frank, her young face showing the strain of recent days. Sergeant Harmon, I wanted to let you know about Hope the baby. A small smile touched her lips. The doctors say she's doing well, gaining weight already. Good to hear, Frank replied, genuinely relieved. And how are you holding up? Sarah straightened, slightly military bearing asserting itself. I'm managing, sir. Just concerned about what happens next. For her, I mean. Frank understood the unasked question. Child Services has protocols for situations like this. They'll try to locate relatives first. And if they can't, the vulnerability beneath her soldier's composure was evident. One step at a time, Private, Frank said gently. Focus on the mission in front of you. The rest will follow. Sarah nodded, accepting the guidance. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As she moved away, Maria appeared at Frank's side. She's barely 19, shouldn't be carrying this weight. None of you should, Frank replied, but you are. And from what I've seen, you're carrying it better than most veterans twice your age. A ghost of a smile touched Maria's lips. High praise from a green beret. Just the truth. They walked together toward the exit, their pace unhurried, both aware that within the facility's walls, time operated differently, a liminal space between crisis and resolution, between combat and aftermath. "There's someone I need to call," Frank said, as they reached the hallway. "If that's permitted." Maria looked curious but didn't press. "I'll check with Agent Mitchell. I'm sure it can be arranged." "Thank you." Frank hesitated, then added, "It's been 5 years, probably past time." Understanding dawned in Maria's eyes. "Your daughter," Frank shook his head. "Her aunt, Sandra, Anna's legal guardian, first step in a long road." Maria nodded approval, evident in her expression. "The hardest battles are often the ones we fight with ourselves, Sergeant." "So I'm learning," Frank replied. "Keen." As they parted ways, Frank found himself standing straighter, his stride more purposeful than it had been in years. The weight of isolation, of grief, of self-imposed exile hadn't lifted entirely. Such burdens never vanished in a single moment of clarity. But sharing Kandahar with Maria's team, committing to help their cause, considering contact with his daughter's family, these were steps towards something he'd abandoned long ago. A future beyond the fortress walls he'd built around his heart. Later that afternoon, in a private room with Agent Mitchell present, as required by protocol, Frank sat before a secure phone. His hand hovered over the keypad, the number for Sandra's home in San Antonio memorized but unused for 5 years, waiting to be dialed. "Take your time, Sergeant," Mitchell said quietly, maintaining a respectful distance. Frank nodded, appreciating her discretion. He drew a deep breath, then dialed each number, a conscious choice, a step back toward the world he'd left behind. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, familiar, yet distant, a ghost from another life. "Hello." Frank's throat tightened, words momentarily failing him. "Hello," Sandra repeated, a touch of impatience entering her tone. "Who's calling?" "Sandra." His voice emerged rough, unused to personal conversation. "It's Frank. Frank Harmon." Silence. Then her voice, carefully controlled. "Frank, it's been a long time." 5 years, he acknowledged. "I know. Why are you calling now? Not hostile, but guarded, protective." Frank chose his words carefully. "I'm in San Antonio, at a federal facility. There's been a situation." He paused. "I thought it was time to reach out." Another silence, longer this time. Frank could almost see her processing the information, weighing possibilities, considering implications. "Are you in trouble?" she finally asked. "No, just a witness in an investigation." He hesitated. "How is she, Anna?" The question hung between them, weighted with years of absence, of birthdays missed, of school events unattended. Frank held his breath, waiting. "She's 10 now," Sandra said finally. "5th grade, plays soccer, loves science." A pause. "She asks about you sometimes." The simple statement hit Frank with physical force. She asks about you. His daughter, whom he'd abandoned to grief and isolation, still remembered him, still wondered. "What do you tell her?" he managed. "The truth, that you're her father, that you loved her mother very much, that losing her was very hard for you." Sandra's voice softened slightly. "That sometimes people need time to heal." Frank closed his eyes, grateful for Sandra's compassion more than he deserved after years of silence. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For that, for everything." "She's a wonderful girl, Frank. Rebecca would be proud." A hesitation. Why now, after all this time? It was the question he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to make this call. Why now? What had changed? The answer came to him with unexpected clarity. "I met some soldiers," he said. "Women who risked everything to do what was right. It reminded me of what matters. Of who I used to be." He paused. "Of who I still should be for Anna." Sandra didn't respond immediately, and Frank wondered if he'd said too much too soon. But when she spoke again, her voice held a cautious warmth. "The court requirements still stand, Frank. Therapy, supervised visits, initially." "I know. Are you ready for that now?" It was the question he'd avoided for 5 years, the one he'd answered by retreating to Lone Pine, by building walls against the world, by turning photographs to face the wall. "Yes," he said, surprised by his own certainty. "I think I am." "Then perhaps when this federal matter is resolved, we could discuss next steps." Her tone remained measured, but not without hope. "Anna should know her father." "I'd like that," Frank replied, emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. Very much. They spoke for a few minutes more practical matters, potential timelines, cautious plans for the future. When the call ended, Frank sat motionless, the phone still in his hand, the weight of the conversation settling around him. Agent Mitchell, who had maintained a discreet silence throughout, finally spoke. That was a big step, Sergeant. Frank nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Family is worth fighting for, she added quietly. Maybe the only thing that truly is. Frank looked up, meeting her gaze. That and the truth. Mitchell smiled slightly, a genuine expression, not the professional mask she typically wore. Indeed, speaking of which, we have new developments in the investigation. Captain Ramirez asked that you join the briefing. Frank rose, compartmentalizing his personal emotions as soldiers learn to do, focusing on the mission at hand. But as he followed Mitchell through the facility corridors, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of possibility, of future of life, extending beyond the fortress walls he'd built around himself. Something worth coming back for when this battle was won. The briefing room was crowded when Frank arrived. Maria and her key team members, several FBI agents, 2 Justice Department officials in suits that marked them as senior personnel. The atmosphere was tense, charged with significance. Maria nodded to Frank as he entered, a subtle acknowledgement of their shared purpose. He took a position at the back of the room, content to observe initially, to understand the dynamics before engaging. Agent Mitchell moved to the front, her professional demeanor firmly in place. Thank you all for assembling on short notice. We have significant developments to share. She nodded to a technical specialist who activated a large display screen. At 0600 this morning, federal agents executed simultaneous search warrants at Colonel Wallace's residence office and private storage facility. The evidence recovered has accelerated our investigation considerably. The screen displayed photographs of documents, electronic devices, ammunitions, and what appeared to be financial records. Most significantly, we recovered an encrypted drive containing communication records between Colonel Wallace and executives at Meridian Resource Development, a private corporation with extensive interests in mineral extraction, particularly rare earth elements used in battery production. Murmurs rippled through the room. Maria exchanged glances with Torres, their earlier suspicions confirmed. These communications, dating back 18 months, outline a systematic plan to secure access to mineral deposits in the border region, specifically in areas with minimal governmental oversight. The language is often coded, but forensic analysis confirms the coordinates match exactly what the village Captain Ramirez's team was ordered to eliminate. One of the Justice Department officials leaned forward. To be clear, Agent Mitchell, you're suggesting a serving colonel in the United States Army contracted his unit for private corporate interests. Not suggesting, sir, confirming. Mitchell's voice was crisp, certain. The evidence includes payment records, operational timelines, and explicit acknowledgement of the need to remove obstacles to resource acquisition. Frank watched Maria's team absorb this information, vindication of their suspicions, confirmation of the evil they had refused to participate in. Their expressions reflected not triumph, but somber validation, the grim satisfaction of having made the right choice at tremendous personal cost. What's Wallace's status? Maria asked the question everyone wanted answered. Mitchell's expression tightened slightly. Colonel Wallace was scheduled for transfer to federal custody this morning. However, during transport, there was an incident. The room tensed, anticipating the worst. The transport vehicle was attacked by unknown assailants. 2 federal agents were injured. Wallace escaped. The news hit like a physical blow. Frank's straightened combat instincts immediately engaged. He's in the wind. Currently, yes, Mitchell confirmed. All federal and local law enforcement agencies have been notified. Borders are being monitored. But Wallace has resources, connections, and extensive field training. He'll come for us, Torres said, voicing what everyone was thinking. For the evidence, for revenge. Mitchell nodded, acknowledging the assessment, which is why we're implementing enhanced security protocols effective immediately. This facility remains secure, but we're preparing contingency relocation plans if necessary. The briefing continued, outlining new security measures, evidence protection protocols, and investigation next steps. Frank listened with the focused attention of a combat veteran, assessing threats, identifying vulnerabilities, planning countermeasures. When the formal briefing concluded and the group began to disperse, Maria approached Frank, her expression grave. "Your thoughts, Sergeant?" Frank considered his response carefully. "Wallace is dangerous, trained and resource desperate, and now cornered. You think he'll attempt a direct assault on a federal facility? Not conventional, no, but he'll have contingency plans channels assets the FBI doesn't know about." Frank's assessment was clinical detached. He needs to eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence, create confusion. He'll find a way to make that happen. Maria absorbed this, her own tactical mind clearly reaching similar conclusions. The team needs to be ready, alert but not panicked, prepared but not paralyzed. Agreed. Frank hesitated, then added, "I'd like to speak with them if that's permitted. Share some experience with operating under threat." Maria nodded immediately. "I think that would be valuable. I'll arrange it." As they walked together toward the team's common area, Frank felt the familiar weight of pre-combat awareness settling across his shoulders, the heightened perception, the tactical calculations, the constant environmental assessment that had kept him alive through 4 combat tours. Wallace was out there planning, preparing, a commander with nothing left to lose, with resources, training, and the desperate need to silence those who could destroy him. The battle for Lone Pine Ranch had been just the opening skirmish. The real war was yet to come. That evening, Frank addressed Maria's team in a small conference room secured for their use. The women sat in a semicircle, faces attentive postures, reflecting their military discipline, despite the civilian clothes they now wore. Frank stood before them, hands clasped behind his back, feet shoulder-width apart, the instinctive stance of an instructor addressing troops. 5 years of isolation fell away as he slipped into the role of combat advisor, a position he'd held many times before his withdrawal from service. Wallace's escape changes the tactical situation. He began without preamble. "You're no longer just witnesses in an investigation. You're high-value targets for a desperate adversary with specialized training and unknown resources." He paused, letting the assessment sink in. These women were soldiers. They deserved unvarnished truth, not comforting platitudes. "The FBI will maintain security protocols, but we need to implement our own measures. Buddy system at all times, regular position checks, constant situational awareness." His gaze swept the room. "Never alone, never unaccounted for, never without communication capability." The women nodded, some taking notes, all focused with the concentration of troops preparing for combat operations. "Wallace knows federal procedures, security protocols, chain of command. He'll look for vulnerabilities for moments of transition or confusion." Frank moved to a whiteboard, sketching a quick diagram of the facility layout. Critical points to monitor: entry protocols, shift changes, supply deliveries, medical transports. For the next hour, Frank outlined defensive measures, counter-surveillance techniques, and emergency response protocols. The women engaged actively, asking focused questions, suggesting refinements based on their specialized knowledge, integrating their ranger training with Frank's Special Forces experience. It was, Frank realized, one of the most effective tactical planning sessions he'd ever conducted. These women were elite operators, bringing both standard military excellence and their unique perspectives to the problem. As the session concluded, Maria addressed her team with quiet authority. "Implement these measures immediately. Coordinate with Agent Mitchell as needed, but maintain our own security protocols." "Understood." "Yes, ma'am," came the unified response. As the team dispersed to their assignments, Sarah approached Frank, her young face serious but composed. "Sergeant Harmon, what about Hope, the baby? She's vulnerable if Wallace targets us." Frank nodded, having already considered this critical weak point. "I'll speak with Agent Mitchell. The child should be moved to a secondary location with appropriate protection." He placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Your concern for her is valid, Private. We'll address it." Relief crossed Sarah's face. "Thank you, sir." After she left, Frank found himself alone with Maria, both of them studying the tactical diagram on the whiteboard. "Your team responded well," he observed. "Professional, focused." "They're the best," Maria replied, simple confidence rather than boast. "But they're also exhausted, stressed, and now facing a new threat dimension. They need rest." "And their captain?" Frank asked quietly. "Does she rest?" Maria glanced at him, a tired smile touching her lips. when the mission allows. The mission requires an effective commander, Frank countered, which means sustainable patterns, not continuous operations. It was the gentle reprimand of a senior non-commissioned officer to a junior commander, a dynamic as old as military hierarchy itself. Maria seemed to recognize it, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Sound advice, Sergeant. She turned from the whiteboard, fatigue evident in the set of her shoulders despite her disciplined posture. How are you holding up? This isn't what you signed up for when you opened your door. Frank considered the question. In truth, the tactical planning, the security assessments, the preparation for potential conflict, all of it felt more natural, more aligned with his core identity than the isolated existence he'd maintained for 5 years. I'm where I need to be, he said simply. Maria studied him, understanding more than he had explicitly stated. You called your daughter's aunt today. Not a question, but Frank nodded confirmation. First step, long road ahead. Worth taking, yes. The certainty in his voice surprised even him. Maria's expression softened slightly. Good. She hesitated, then added, We've pulled you back into a war you didn't choose, Frank. I'm sorry for that. Some wars choose us, he replied, and some are worth fighting. Their eyes met, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Two soldiers who had seen the worst of humanity, but still believed in protecting the best of it. Not a romantic connection, but something perhaps more profound, the recognition of kindred spirits, of shared values that transcended circumstance. The moment was interrupted by Agent Mitchell's arrival, her expression tense despite her professional composure. Captain Ramirez, Sergeant Harmon, we have a situation developing. Both soldiers immediately shifted to alert readiness, personal considerations set aside. What's happened? Maria asked. We've intercepted communications suggesting Wallace has activated a network of former operators, private contractors with military backgrounds. They're mobilizing purpose unknown, but timing suspicious. Frank's mind immediately began tactical assessment. Timeline, unclear. The intelligence is fragmentary, but movement detected in multiple locations coordinated. Mitchell's gaze was direct. We're implementing heightened security protocols and preparing for potential relocation if necessary. Maria nodded, already shifting to command mode. My team will be ready. How long to prepare transport? 4 hours at minimum. We need secure vehicles, route planning, destination preparation. Mitchell glanced at her watch. Target for movement is 0200 hours under cover of darkness. We'll be ready, Maria confirmed. Where's the new secure location? Mitchell hesitated. That information is compartmentalized for now. Need-to-know basis only until departure. Frank understood the security protocol, but noted the tactical limitation it created. Without knowing the destination, Maria's team couldn't prepare adequately for arrival's security, environmental assessment, defensive positioning. We'll need advance information for proper tactical preparation, he observed. Mitchell nodded, acknowledging the concern. I'll see what I can arrange. In the meantime, prepare your people, Captain. Essential items only ready to move on short notice. After Mitchell left, Maria immediately activated her team's alert system, a series of text codes sent to their secured devices. Within minutes, the women had assembled in the common area, alert and focused despite the late hour. Frank watched as Maria briefed them, concise, factual, no unnecessary elaboration. Classic military communication in crisis situations. Her team responded with the disciplined efficiency he'd come to expect, immediately organizing into task groups, preparing equipment, establishing security protocols. As the preparation unfolded, Frank moved to a window overlooking the facility perimeter, scanning the darkness beyond the security lights with practiced eyes. Wallace was out there somewhere, planning, gathering resources, preparing to strike. Frank had encountered such adversaries before, determined, resourceful, dangerous. But he'd never faced one on American soil targeting American soldiers with the resources of both military connections and corporate power behind him. This wasn't a conventional battlefield with clear lines, defined objectives, established rules of engagement. This was shadow warfare fought in the gray spaces between military authority and civilian law, between official sanction and deniable operations. Frank turned from the window, moving to assist Maria's team with preparation. Whatever came next, he was committed now to these women, to their truth, to the justice they sought, and perhaps through that commitment to his own redemption as well. The night deepened as they prepared, the facility settling into the tense quiet of heightened security, additional patrols, enhanced surveillance-controlled movement. Frank noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere, the increased vigilance of security personnel, the careful monitoring of all facility access points. The FBI was taking the threat seriously. As midnight approached, Frank found himself in the small room assigned to him, packing the few personal items he'd been provided. His movements were efficient, practiced the automatic actions of a soldier preparing for deployment, for movement under potential threat. A soft knock interrupted his preparation. When he opened the door, Maria stood in the hallway, her own go-bag slung over her shoulder. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low. Frank stepped back, allowing her to enter. She moved to the center of the room, surveying his preparations with a soldier's assessing eye. "All set," she asked. "Ready to move," he confirmed. "Your team prepared, on standby." She hesitated, then added, "Agent Mitchell has approved sharing the destination details with us. We're being moved to a secondary federal facility outside Austin. More remote, easier to secure." Frank nodded, processing the tactical implications. 2-hour drive, multiple potential routes, rural approaches, defensible position if properly managed. Exactly. Maria placed her bag on the floor, her posture suggesting she had more to discuss than just logistics. "There's something else. The FBI has discovered a potential connection between Meridian Resources and a senior official at the Pentagon. Someone who could have provided Wallace with operational cover authorization resources. The implications were significant corruption reaching into the highest levels of military authority, corporate influence penetrating the chain of command. It explained Wallace's confidence, his belief that he could operate with impunity." "Name?" Frank asked. "Not yet confirmed, but if true, it means this goes beyond Wallace, beyond one rogue operation." Maria's expression was grave. "It means systemic corruption potentially affecting multiple operations, multiple units." Frank absorbed this understanding, the broader implications. What Maria's team had stumbled upon wasn't an isolated incident of command overreach. It was potentially the tip of a much larger iceberg, a cancer within the military structure itself. "All the more reason to secure your testimony, your evidence," he observed. "This might be bigger than any of us realized." Maria nodded, the weight of responsibility evident in her bearing. "Which makes us an even greater threat to those involved." She met his gaze directly. "Wallace won't be operating alone now. He'll have institutional support resources, protection from above." "Making our position more vulnerable," Frank concluded. "Yes." Maria's voice remained steady, but Frank could see the strain beneath her professional composure, the burden of leading her team through escalating danger, of carrying truth that powerful forces wanted silenced. Without thinking, Frank reached out, placing his hand on her shoulder, a soldier's gesture of support, of shared burden. "We've faced worse odds." A brief smile touched Maria's lips. "Have we? Afghanistan, Iraq. Places where everyone wanted us dead and no one was coming to help." Frank's grip tightened, slightly reassuring. "At least here we have some of the good guys on our side." Maria nodded, drawing strength from the simple truth. After a moment, she straightened, military bearing reasserting itself. "Get some rest if you can, Sergeant. Movement at 0200. You too, Captain. Long day ahead." After she left, Frank completed his preparations, then stretched out on the bed, not expecting sleep, but knowing the value of even brief rest before potential combat operations. His mind remained alert, processing scenarios, evaluating threats, preparing responses. But beneath the tactical calculations, another thought persisted, the call to Sandra, the possibility of seeing Anna, the glimpse of a future beyond isolation and grief. For the first time in years, Frank Harmon had something personal to protect, something to return to when this mission was complete, a reason beyond duty to survive whatever came next. Outside the facility, darkness pressed against the security perimeter, concealing movements in the shadows beyond the lights. Somewhere in that darkness, Wallace and his forces were preparing, plotting, gathering strength for the strike they all knew was coming, the calm before the storm. As the facility around him shifted into pre-movement operations, security sweeps, transport preparation, route planning, Frank closed his eyes, not sleeping, but entering the meditative stillness combat veterans learned to find in moments of preparation, the quiet center from which action would spring when needed. Whatever came next, he would be ready. Retrie. Next edit. The convoy departed the federal facility at precisely 0200 hours, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a military operation. 3 unmarked SUVs containing Maria's team, flanked by FBI transport vehicles at front and rear lights, dimmed communications limited to secure channels. Frank rode in the middle vehicle with Maria Torres and Johnson, his combat instincts fully engaged, scanning intersections, noting potential ambush points, tracking their route against mental maps of the region. H.I.M. Mitchell led the convoy from the lead vehicle, her voice occasionally coming through the secure radio, confirming route changes, checkpoints, security protocols. The night pressed against the windows, the Texas landscape a shadowed blur beyond the glass. Standard convoy protocol, Maria observed quietly, her own attention equally focused on their surroundings. Randomized route, varied speeds, communication discipline. Frank nodded, appreciating the professional execution. Mitchell knows what she's doing. Former military herself, Torres added from the back seat. Marine Corps intelligence before FBI. Explains her approach. The convoy maintained a measured pace, neither too fast to react to threats, nor too slow to present an easy target. 30 minutes outside San Antonio, they shifted to rural highways, traffic thinning to occasional trucks and late-night travelers. An hour later, they turned onto secondary roads, then unpaved county routes, progressively isolating themselves from civilian infrastructure, from potential witnesses, from immediate assistance if needed. A tactical necessity that created its own vulnerability. Frank felt the familiar tension building at the base of his skull, the combat awareness that had kept him alive through 4 deployments. Not fear, but heightened perception, the body's natural preparation for potential threat. Approaching checkpoint Alpha, Mitchell's voice came through the radio. All units maintain formation, prepare for security verification. The convoy slowed as they approached a rural intersection where 2 FBI vehicles were positioned, agents visible with tactical gear and verification equipment. Standard procedure for high-security transport. Pre-positioned checkpoints. Identity confirmation. Route security. The lead vehicle stopped for verification. Mitchell visible through the windshield, presenting credentials to the checkpoint agents. Frank watched the process with professional assessment, noting the proper protocols being followed, the systematic approach. Then he saw a subtle detail that triggered immediate alarm. One of the checkpoint agents was wearing his tactical vest incorrectly secured, the side straps hanging loose rather than properly fastened. No trained federal agent would deploy with improperly secured gear. Something's wrong, Frank said quietly, body tensing. The checkpoint. It's compromised. Maria immediately shifted to alert status, her hand moving to the sidearm she'd been authorized to carry. How do you know? Gear configuration, training error. Frank's voice remained calm despite the surge of adrenaline. No federal agent wears a tactical vest unsecured. Before Maria could respond, the scene erupted into coordinated violence. The agents at the checkpoint produced automatic weapons, opening fire on the lead vehicle. Simultaneously, 2 unmarked trucks roared from concealed positions on either side of the road, blocking escape routes front and rear. Classic ambush tactics professionally executed. The convoy exploded into defensive action. The FBI security teams returned fire, taking cover behind their vehicles. In the lead SUV, Mitchell and her team were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat under the concentrated fire. Contact front, contact rear, Johnson reported, immediately shifting to combat communication. Ambush pattern, multiple hostiles. Their driver, an FBI agent with tactical training, executed an immediate defensive maneuver, reversing sharply, then cutting the wheel to position their vehicle behind a roadside embankment, providing partial cover from the main firing positions. Frank's combat training, engage automatically. Torres, secure this position. Johnson, establish gains with other vehicles if possible. Maria, with me, we need to assess and counter. The transition from passenger to tactical operator was instantaneous, 5 years of civilian life falling away as combat necessity took precedence. Frank moved low along the embankment, using natural cover, Maria following with equal discipline. From their new vantage point, the tactical situation became clear. Approximately 12 attackers, well-armed, using coordinated fire and movement techniques to systematically isolate and neutralize the convoy. Professional operators, not common mercenaries. Wallace's team executing a precisely planned ambush. They've cut us off from the other vehicles. Maria observed, her voice calm despite the danger. Trying to isolate us in sections. Frank nodded, already formulating counter tactics. Standard procedure: divide, isolate, eliminate. We need to disrupt their coordination, create confusion in their command structure. He scanned the battlefield, identifying the apparent leader, a tall figure directing the assault from behind one of the blocking vehicles. The man's posture, his command presence, his tactical positioning, all marked him as the operation controller. Look at the command element, Frank decided. Disrupt their coordination. Create an opening for our forces to regroup. Maria understood immediately. I'll move left, establish a crossfire position. You target the leader from here. Frank nodded, approving her tactical assessment. Go, I'll cover your movement. Maria slipped away, using the darkness and terrain features for concealment, moving with the disciplined stealth of a ranger. Frank watched her progress, then shifted his attention to the firefight unfolding before them. The FBI security teams were responding professionally, but were clearly outmatched by the precision and coordination of the ambush force. The lead vehicle containing Mitchell was taking concentrated fire, its position increasingly vulnerable as the attackers maneuvered for better angles. Frank assessed range, wind visibility, the automatic calculations of a combat veteran. The command figure was approximately 80 yards distant, partially concealed behind a vehicle directing the assault with hand signals and what appeared to be a tactical radio. Not an impossible shot, but challenging under current conditions. Frank steadied his breathing, slowing his heart rate through practice control. He sighted carefully, compensating for distance and environmental factors, focusing entirely on the target. The shot, when he took it, was clean and precise, not a kill shot, but a disabling one, striking the commander in the shoulder, spinning him backward and disrupting his control of the operation. The effect was immediate. The assault pattern faltered as subordinates looked to their fallen leader. The coordinated fire momentarily disorganized. From her flanking position, Maria exploited the confusion, targeting two attackers who had exposed themselves while repositioning. The momentary advantage allowed the FBI teams to regroup, establishing a more coherent defensive position. Mitchell's voice came through the radio, tense but controlled. All units fall back to position Bravo. Repeat, fall back to position Bravo. Position Bravo, a pre-established rally point in case of route compromise. Frank remembered it from the security briefing: an abandoned ranch structure 2 miles east, designated as an emergency rendezvous location. Understood, Frank responded, providing covering fire for withdrawal. He and Maria maintained their positions, targeting the ambush force with disciplined fire, creating windows of opportunity for the convoy vehicles to disengage and begin tactical withdrawal. The FBI teams had responded professionally, executing a phased retreat while maintaining defensive coverage. The attackers, recovering from the disruption of their command structure, attempted to prevent the withdrawal, but their coordinated advantage had been compromised. Their fire became more sporadic, their movements less synchronized. Last vehicle clear, came the report over the radio. Proceed to rally point. Frank signaled to Maria, and they began their own withdrawal using alternating cover movements. One advancing, while the other provided security, then switching roles, maintaining tactical discipline despite the pressure of combat. The night erupted in renewed gunfire as the attackers realized their targets were escaping. Rounds impacted around them, chipping earth, splintering trees, the distinctive crack of high-velocity projectiles cutting through the darkness. Frank and Maria maintained their discipline, their movement steady, controlled, professional. Not rushing, not panicking, but executing the tactical withdrawal they'd both been trained to perform under fire. As they reached the tree line that would provide cover for their route to the rally point, Frank paused, scanning behind them one last time. The ambush force was regrouping, the wounded commander back on his feet, directing pursuit operations. They'll track us, Frank observed, his breathing controlled despite the exertion. Standard procedure after a broken ambush. Maria nodded, already calculating their next moves. We need to split their forces, create confusion in their pursuit pattern. Agreed. Frank assessed their options. False trail east, actual movement, south, then loop to the rally point. Classic counter-tracking technique. Without further discussion, they implemented the plan, laying a deceptive trail in one direction before moving in another, using terrain features to mask their true route, employing the counter-tracking methods both had learned through years of specialized training. The night enveloped them as they moved through the Texas backcountry, two soldiers operating on instinct and training, their communication minimal, their coordination automatic. Despite having never served together, their shared military background created an operational harmony that required no explanation, no clarification. Two professionals executing their craft with precision. An hour later, they approached the rally point, a dilapidated ranch structure set back from the road, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. Frank signaled a halt, and they observed the location from cover, assessing security, checking for signs of compromise. Vehicles present, Maria noted. Formation indicates friendly forces, not hostile takeover. Frank agreed with her assessment. The vehicles were positioned for defensive coverage rather than ambush preparation, and he could discern movement patterns consistent with friendly security protocols. Approach with caution, he suggested. Authentication before exposure. Maria nodded, activating her secure radio. Checkpoint Bravo, this is Ramirez. Authentication code Sierra Echo 79. A pause, then Mitchell's voice responded. Authentication confirmed. Approach from the east entrance, hands visible. They followed the protocol, emerging from cover with proper disciplined hands, away from weapons movement, deliberate and non-threatening. FBI security personnel verified their identities before allowing them to enter the perimeter. Inside the abandoned structure, the remainder of their convoy had established a temporary defensive position. Vehicle damage was evident: bullet holes in metal, shattered glass, flattened tires. Several personnel showed minor injuries, cuts, bruises, one agent with a bandaged arm. Mitchell approached immediately, a relief evident despite her professional composure. Captain Ramirez, Sergeant Harmon, glad you made it. We were preparing a search operation. Tactical withdrawal required alternative route, Maria explained simply. Is everyone accounted for? Mitchell nodded. All personnel present, 3 injuries, none critical. Vehicles compromised but functional for limited movement. Frank surveyed the assembled group, noting Maria's team gathered in one corner of the structure, maintaining unit cohesion despite the chaos. They appeared alert, disciplined, weapons ready but controlled. The ambush force, he asked. Pursuit teams deployed, last report, Mitchell replied. We've called for reinforcement and secure transport, but current situation assessment suggests continued vulnerability. Frank understood the implication. Wallace's team had compromised their route, infiltrated their security protocols, executed a professional ambush. The entire operation had been penetrated, which meant secure transport reinforcement. Even the rally point itself couldn't be considered truly safe. They knew our route, Maria observed, giving voice to what they were all thinking. Our checkpoints, our protocols. Which means high-level compromise, Mitchell confirmed grimly. We have to assume all standard procedures are potentially exposed. Frank assessed their tactical situation with cold precision. Damaged vehicles, limited ammunition, compromised protocols, unknown enemy strength and position, uncertain reinforcement timeline. A classic bad situation getting worse. We need to abandon standard procedures, he concluded. Create our own security protocol independent of established channels. Mitchell nodded, clearly having reached the same conclusion. Agreed, Upti, but that limits our resources, our support options. Better limited resources than compromised ones, Maria countered. We need to move to a location not in any official database, not connected to federal protocols. A moment of silence followed as the implications settled among them. Going off-grid meant abandoning the institutional support that had protected them thus far, relying instead on their own resources, their own judgment, their own capabilities. Frank found himself speaking before he had fully processed the decision. Lone Pine Ranch, my property, off-grid, defensible, not connected to any federal database. All eyes turned to him, the offer hanging in the air between them. Your home has already been compromised, Mitchell pointed out. Wallace knows its location, its vulnerabilities. Its known vulnerabilities, Frank corrected. What he saw during the first engagement was a fraction of the property's defensive capabilities. And he's not expecting us to return there. It's the last place he'd anticipate us going. Maria considered this, her tactical mind clearly processing the strategic implications. Sometimes the most obvious location is the least expected, she observed, especially when the enemy believes it's been eliminated as an option. Mitchell remained skeptical. It's a significant risk, and we'd be outside normal protective protocols. Normal protective protocols just tried to kill us, Torres pointed out from where she sat with her injured leg elevated. I'll take the sergeant's ranch over federal security at this point. A murmur of agreement ran through Maria's team, their trust in conventional protection shaken by the night's events. Mitchell noted their response, then turned back to Frank. You're certain about this returning to Lone Pine would put you squarely in Wallace's crosshairs again? Frank met her gaze steadily. I've been in crosshairs before, Agent Mitchell. The difference is at my ranch, I control the battlefield. The confidence in his voice wasn't bravado, but the simple certainty of a soldier who knew his ground, his capabilities, his tactical advantages. Mitchell seemed to recognize this, nodding slowly in acknowledgement. Very well. I'll need to inform my superiors of the change in protocol, but given the circumstances, I believe they'll authorize the deviation. She checked her watch. Dawn in 2 hours. We should move before full light exposes our position. As Mitchell moved away to make secure communications, Maria approached Frank, her expression questioning. You're sure about this? Your home has already seen one battle. It was built for more, Frank replied simply, and this time we'll be better prepared. Maria studied him, seeming to weigh something in her mind before speaking again. When this is over, when Wallace is contained, and the truth is secured, what then? For you, I mean. The question caught Frank off guard, forcing him to consider beyond the immediate tactical situation to the future that might follow, a future he'd only just begun to reimagine after 5 years of isolation. I spoke with Sandra yesterday, he said after a moment, about Anna, about the possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship there. Maria's expression softened slightly. That's good, Frank. A start. A start, he agreed. The rest, I don't know yet. One battle at a time. She nodded, understanding the soldier's mindset. Focus on the immediate mission, let the future resolve itself when the present danger is addressed. One battle at a time, she echoed. And right now, that battle is taking us back to Lone Pine Ranch. Around them, the temporary command post hummed with controlled activity as personnel prepared for movement, securing equipment, treating injuries, establishing communications protocols. The night pressed against the windows, concealing both danger and opportunity in its darkness. In 2 hours, they would move. In 6, they would reach Lone Pine. And there on ground, Frank knew better than any living soul they would make their stand against Wallace and whatever forces he could bring to bear. Not the battle Frank had expected when he'd opened his door to 11 women in military fatigues just days ago, but perhaps the battle he'd been preparing for all along without knowing it. The journey to Lone Pine Ranch unfolded in tense silence, the convoy moving through pre-dawn darkness with tactical discipline. No headlights, minimal radio communication routes selected for concealment rather than speed. Frank rode in the lead vehicle, now guiding them through back roads and ranch trails he'd mapped during his years of isolation, paths unknown to GPS systems or federal databases. Mitchell had established a stripped-down security protocol, only essential personnel, minimal electronic footprint communication limited to direct channels rather than routed through institutional systems. The vulnerability of their previous arrangements had forced a return to basics: soldiers' instincts over technological advantage, human judgment over procedural certainty. As the Texas landscape gradually lightened with approaching dawn, Frank felt a strange sense of homecoming mixed with tactical preparation. Lone Pine Ranch had been his refuge, his fortress against the world. Now it would become a battleground again, but this time with full preparation, with clear purpose. 2 miles ahead, he informed Mitchell, who drove with the focused concentration of a combat operator. Approach from the western fire road, not the main entrance. Less exposed, better defensive coverage. Mitchell nodded, following his guidance without question. The respect between them had evolved during the night's events, the FBI agent recognizing in Frank not just a witness to protect, but a tactical asset, a combat veteran whose expertise might mean the difference between success and failure in the coming confrontation. Behind them, the remainder of the convoy followed in tight formation, 3 vehicles containing Maria's team, 2 FBI security vehicles providing rear coverage. All damaged to varying degrees from the ambush, all operating at reduced capacity, but maintaining disciplined movement nonetheless. Wallace will have tracking teams deployed, Mitchell observed as they turned onto the unmarked fire road Frank had indicated. Standard pursuit protocol after a broken ambush. Yes, Frank agreed, but he'll be tracking based on conventional movement patterns, expected routes. This approach vector isn't in any database, isn't visible from satellite imagery. You've thought about this? Mitchell noted. Defensive approaches concealed movement options. 5 years to think, Frank replied simply, and a lifetime of training before that. As they crested a small rise, Lone Pine Ranch came into view in the early morning light. The main house, the barn, the outbuildings arranged in tactical positioning rather than conventional ranch layout. From this angle, the defensive nature of the property was more evident. Sightlines arranged for maximum coverage approaches, channeled through controllable vectors, natural terrain features incorporated into security positioning. You built a fortress. Mitchell observed professional appreciation in her tone. I built a home, Frank corrected quietly. The fortress came naturally. They approached the property from the western edge, using a barely visible track that wound through dense brush before emerging near the barn. Frank directed the convoy to a concealed position behind the structure where vehicles would be hidden from aerial observation or long-distance surveillance. As they disembarked, Maria's team immediately established a security perimeter, moving with the disciplined efficiency Frank had come to expect from them. No orders needed, no confusion, just professional soldiers executing their craft. Frank led Mitchell and Maria to the main house, noting the damage still visible from the previous engagement, bullet holes in the siding, a shattered window boarded over scorch marks on the porch where a flashbang had detonated. But the structure remained sound, its core integrity uncompromised. Inside dust had settled on the furniture, a thin layer of abandonment despite the brief time since their departure. Frank moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, activating systems, securing entry points, conducting a rapid security assessment. Main structure intact, he reported. Defensive positions viable. We'll need to establish a command post medical station and fallback protocol. Mitchell nodded, already coordinating with her team via secure radio, establishing the operational parameters for their unorthodox security arrangement. Maria moved to the windows, assessing fields of fire defensive coverage, potential vulnerability points. Better than the federal facility in some ways, she observed. More flexible, more adaptive, less constrained by protocol. And more vulnerable in others, Frank acknowledged. Limited personnel, limited resources, limited support options. But we have one advantage they don't, Maria replied, turning to face him. We have the home field edge, and a Green Beret who knows every inch of it. Something in her confidence, her calm certainty in the face of overwhelming odds, reminded Frank of commanders he'd served under in combat zones, leaders who understood that victory often came not from superior resources, but from superior commitment, superior adaptation, superior will. We'll make it count, he promised. As the team established their defensive position, Frank moved to a concealed panel in the living room wall, releasing a hidden latch to reveal a recessed compartment. Inside, untouched for years, tactical equipment, communication gear, specialized weapons components. Mitchell observed with raised eyebrows. You were serious about being prepared. Afghanistan teaches preparedness, Frank replied, removing items methodically. Iraq reinforces the lesson. He distributed the equipment to Maria's team: communication earpieces, tactical vests, specialized ammunition. The women accepted the gear with professional appreciation, incorporating it into their positioning with practiced efficiency. By mid-morning, Lone Pine Ranch had been transformed from isolated homestead to forward operating base. Defensive positions established around the perimeter. Medical stations set up in the reinforced cellar. Communication protocols established between security teams. Fallback positions identified and supplied. Frank stood on the porch with Maria and Mitchell surveying their preparations. The Texas sun beat down from a cloudless sky, illuminating the landscape in harsh clarity. No shadows to hide in, no darkness to conceal movement, both advantage and vulnerability. Wallace will come, Mitchell stated, not a question, but an assessment. His entire operation is compromised if your team testifies. He has no choice but to attempt termination. Yes, Maria agreed. The question is when and with what force. Frank considered this, weighing tactical options, enemy capabilities, strategic imperatives. Soon, within 24 hours, he needs to move before federal reinforcement can arrive, before your testimony is formally secured. And his approach, Mitchell asked. Direct but disguised, Frank assessed. He'll attempt to appear as legitimate authority, federal agents, military police, something with the veneer of official sanction. He needs to eliminate witnesses while maintaining plausible deniability. Maria nodded clearly, having reached similar conclusions. So we prepare for a force presenting as official but operating outside legal parameters. Exactly. Frank pointed to the northern ridgeline. Primary approach vector there, best visibility stable ground for vehicles. Secondary approach from the east using the dry creek bed as cover. We establish defensive positions accordingly. Challenge all approaching personnel, maintain strict authentication protocols. Mitchell's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. She listened intently, her expression tightening as she received the information. Update from FBI headquarters, she reported after signing off. Wallace has been officially designated a fugitive. All federal and military authorities notified. But she hesitated. 3 of his known associates have credentials identifying them as Defense Intelligence Agency operatives with appropriate documentation. The implication was clear. Wallace could approach under the guise of legitimate authority using genuine credentials to attempt access to create confusion to divide their defensive response. We establish a single authentication channel, Frank decided. No access granted without direct verification through Agent Mitchell, regardless of credentials presented. Agreed, Mitchell confirmed. I'll establish the protocol. As she moved away to coordinate with her team, Maria remained beside Frank, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where threat might emerge at any moment. We're asking a lot of these women, she said quietly. They signed up to serve their country, not to fight its corrupted elements. Sometimes serving means fighting the corruption within, Frank replied, as you did when you refused Wallace's order. Maria nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of this. And you? What are you fighting for, Frank? You could have walked away at any point when we first arrived after the federal team took over after the ambush. But you're still here. Frank considered the question, searching for the honest answer beneath tactical considerations and military obligation. What was he fighting for, Not abstract principles of justice or truth, though those mattered. Not professional duty or personal honor, though both were engaged. I'm fighting for the future, he said finally. Mine, yours, your team's, my daughter's. He paused, finding unexpected certainty in his words. For the chance to build something after the fighting stops. Maria studied him, seeming to look beyond the soldier to the man beneath, the father who'd lost his way, the husband who'd lost his anchor, the warrior who'd lost his purpose, and who might through this unexpected battle be finding all 3 again. Then we'd better win, she said simply. Before Frank could respond, Torres approached from her observation position at the barn, her expression tense despite her disciplined composure. Movement on the northern ridge, she reported. Vehicles, military pattern, 4 units visible, more suspected behind the tree line. Frank and Maria exchanged glances, the moment of personal connection set aside as combat necessity took precedence. Positions, Maria ordered, immediately shifting to command mode. Full defensive protocol, no engagement without authorization. As Maria's team moved with practiced efficiency to their assigned locations, Frank conducted a final assessment of their preparations. The ranch house Central Command Medical Station, primary defensive position. The barn's secondary command, flanking coverage, fallback position if the house was compromised. The outbuildings and natural terrain features, observation posts, fire support positions, evacuation routes if needed. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but defensible, especially against an adversary who didn't fully understand its capabilities, its hidden strengths, its concealed resources. Mitchell joined them, her own team deployed in supporting positions around the property. Vehicles approaching the main road. Standard military pattern, unmarked but consistent with federal tactical units. Wallace, Frank confirmed, presenting as official authority as expected. Mitchell nodded grimly. I've notified FBI headquarters. Legitimate reinforcement is mobilizing, but estimated arrival time is 3 hours minimum. We hold until then, Maria stated, not a question, but a declaration. Frank checked his weapon one final time, the familiar weight of it grounding him in the present moment, in the tactical reality they faced. We hold, he agreed. Together they moved to their primary defensive position, the reinforced front room of the ranch house with clear sight lines to the approaching road, with overlapping fields of fire from supporting positions in the barn and outbuildings. The vehicles appeared on the main road, moving with the measured discipline of a military convoy, 4 black SUVs in standard formation, followed by 2 larger transport vehicles. No markings, no identification, but the positioning, the approach pattern, all spoke of professional tactical operation. Estimate 16 to 20 personnel, Torres reported from her observation position. Standard tactical gear, military-grade weapons visible but not deployed in aggressive posture. The convoy halted at the ranch gate, maintaining formation engines, running a posture of readiness rather than peaceful arrival. From the lead vehicle, a tall figure emerged, silver hair catching the morning sunlight, posture military straight despite recent injury. Colonel James Wallace in full-dress uniform, decorations visible even at this distance. Bold move, Mitchell observed, presenting himself openly in uniform, creating the appearance of legitimate authority. Calculated risk, Frank assessed. He needs to maintain the narrative that this is an official military operation, not a rogue action. Wallace surveyed the property with practiced assessment, then raised a handheld megaphone to address them. This is Colonel James Wallace, United States Army Special Operations Command. I have been authorized to secure this location and take custody of all personnel present under provisions of National Security Protocol Delta 7. His voice carried clearly across the morning air, professional, authoritative, designed to project legitimate command presence. No such protocol exists, Mitchell muttered. He's creating fictional authority. Wallace continued, his tone unwavering. All federal personnel are ordered to stand down and transfer custody of Captain Ramirez and her team to military authority immediately. Failure to comply will be considered obstruction of a classified military operation. Mitchell stepped forward, her own megaphone in hand. Colonel Wallace, this is Special Agent Diana Mitchell, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have been designated a fugitive from justice. You have no authority here. Surrender yourself and your personnel immediately. A tense silence followed the two authorities facing each other across the dusty yard, the balance of power uncertain, the potential for violence palpable in the morning air. Wallace's posture shifted slightly, a subtle tensing that Frank recognized as preparation for escalation. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened, the pretense of bureaucratic authority giving way to the direct threat beneath. Agent Mitchell, you are interfering in a classified military operation. This is your final warning. Stand down or face the consequences. Mitchell stood her ground, FBI credentials held visibly. Colonel Wallace, you are wanted for multiple federal crimes, including conspiracy, attempted murder of federal agents, and illegal use of military assets. There will be no negotiation. Surrender now. Wallace's response was immediate and decisive. He made a sharp hand gesture, and his forces deployed with practiced coordination, personnel exiting vehicles, taking tactical positions, weapons raised but not yet firing. A clear demonstration of force, a final warning before violence. All personnel maintain defensive positions, Maria ordered through their secure communication channel. No engagement without direct threat. I repeat, hold position. Frank watched the deployment with professional assessment, noting the tactical formations, the coordinated positioning, the disciplined execution. These weren't common mercenaries or hired guns. These were trained operators, likely former military, possibly still active duty men, who believed they were operating under legitimate authority or who had been paid well enough not to question. Wallace raised the megaphone one final time. Captain Ramirez, you and your team are ordered to surrender to military custody immediately. This is a direct order from your commanding officer. Maria stepped forward, visible in the doorway but protected by the reinforced frame, her own voice carrying across the yard without amplification, clear, steady, commanding. You are not my commanding officer, Colonel Wallace. You are a criminal attempting to cover up your crimes. We will not surrender to you or any illegal authority you claim to represent. Her defiance, delivered with calm military precision rather than emotional resistance, seemed to impact Wallace visibly, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a tightening of his jaw, apparent even at this distance. For a moment, the tableau held Wallace and his forces arrayed before the ranch, about Maria and her defenders positioned within. The morning sun beat down, cicadas buzzed in the dry grass, a hawk circled overhead, nature indifferent to the human conflict unfolding below. Then Wallace lowered the megaphone, turned to his second-in-command, and issued an order too quiet to hear. The response was immediate and overwhelming, coordinated gunfire directed at the ranch house. The barn, all defensive positions identified during the previous engagement. Not warning shots, not suppression fire, but deliberate targeted assault. Contact all positions. Torres reported through the communication channel, taking fire from multiple vectors. Return fire defensive pattern, Maria ordered. Conserve ammunition, target leaders, and communication elements. The ranch erupted in disciplined response, Maria's team engaging from prepared positions, FBI personnel providing supporting fire, all coordinated through the secure communication network Frank had established. Frank himself moved to a reinforced window position, assessing the enemy deployment with combat-trained eyes. Wallace's forces were executing a standard envelopment pattern, main force maintaining frontal pressure, while flanking elements attempted to maneuver around the defensive perimeter. Textbook military assault tactics against a fixed position. Eastern approach compromised, came Johnson's tense report. 3 hostiles attempting to access the rear entrance. I have them, Frank responded, already moving through the house toward the threatened position. He reached the eastern window as the attackers approached 3 operators in tactical gear, moving with professional discipline toward the back door. Frank waited until they were fully committed to the approach, then engaged 3 rapid shots carefully placed for maximum effect with minimum lethality. 1 attacker down with a leg wound, 1 with a shoulder, hit the 3rd diving for cover unhurt, but effectively neutralized as an immediate threat. East secure for now, he reported, but they'll adapt, try different vectors. Copy that, Maria acknowledged. Mitchell reports FBI reinforcement ETA now 2 hours. We need to hold until then. The firefight intensified as Wallace's forces adjusted their approach using the terrain features around the ranch for cover, establishing firing positions, with overlapping fields attempting to suppress the defenders, while assault teams maneuvered for entry points. Frank moved through the house with combat efficiency, reinforcing vulnerable positions, adjusting defensive coverage, coordinating with Maria's team to maintain their perimeter integrity. The familiar rhythm of battle, assess, decide, act, reassess came naturally. 5 years of civilian life falling away beneath the demands of combat. Outside, Wallace directed the assault from a protected position behind one of the transport vehicles, his tactical experience evident in the coordinated pressure his forces applied, probing for weaknesses, adapting to resistance, maintaining disciplined fire rather than wasting ammunition. They're good, Torres observed during a brief lull, wiping sweat from her forehead with a dirt-streaked sleeve. Professional, coordinated. Yes, Frank agreed, but fighting for the wrong reasons. Fighting to hide truth rather than protect it. Torres nodded, understanding the distinction. Motivation mattered in prolonged engagement, the will to continue when exhaustion set in, when casualties mounted, when the initial plan failed and adaptation became necessary. The assault resumed with renewed intensity, Wallace's forces now employing smoke grenades to obscure their movement, using the cover to reposition assault teams for a coordinated breach attempt. They're setting up for a 3-point entry, Frank assessed, watching the deployment of pattern. Standard breach protocol, simultaneous entry, front, rear, and side to overwhelm defensive response. Maria processed this, then made an immediate tactical decision. Johnson Torres maintain house defense. Mitchell's team supports from secondary positions. Sergeant Harmon with me, we counter their command element directly. The strategy was bold but sound rather than trying to defend against all 3 breach points, with limited personnel target the command structure, controlling the assault. Disrupt Wallace himself and the coordinated attack would falter. Frank moved to Maria's position, understanding her intent without detailed explanation. 2 combat veterans operating on shared tactical understanding, on mutual professional respect. Northwest approach through the cellar tunnel, he suggested, emerges behind their vehicle position. Wallace won't have identified it as an exit point. Maria nodded, approving the rope. Lead the way, Sergeant. They moved quickly to the cellar, Frank revealing a concealed door behind shelving units, an emergency exit he had built years ago, part of his elaborate preparation for threats that had seemed paranoid until this moment. Narrow passage 400 meters emerges in the dry creek bed north of the property, he explained as they entered the tunnel. Built it during my first year here. Never thought I'd actually use it. Good thing you were paranoid, Maria observed, following him into the darkness, weapon ready but controlled. The tunnel was cramped but navigable, reinforced with timber supports. The floor packed earth worn smooth by Frank's maintenance checks over the years. They moved in silence, conserving breath, maintaining tactical discipline despite the claustrophobic conditions. Above them, the firefight continued, muffled by earth and distance, but still audible the rhythmic exchange of gunfire marking the ongoing struggle between Wallace's forces and the defenders at the ranch. After 10 minutes of careful movement, Frank halted, indicating a ladder leading upward to a concealed hatch. Exit point 20 meters from the creek bed, visual coverage limited by brush growth. We'll need to move fast once we emerge. Maria nodded, understanding the tactical necessity. Ready when you are. Frank ascended the ladder, carefully releasing the hatch mechanism designed for silent operation. He scanned the surroundings before signaling Maria to follow both of them, emerging into the brush-covered depression north of the property. From this position, they could see Wallace's vehicles from behind the transport units, the command SUV where Wallace directed the assault, the tactical deployment of his forces focused entirely on the ranch buildings before them. They had achieved perfect flanking position, completely undetected. Command vehicle primary target, Maria whispered. Disable communications first, then neutralize Wallace himself. Frank nodded agreement. Approach from west side using brush line for cover. 20 seconds to position, then simultaneous action on your mark. They separated slightly, each taking a different approach vector toward the command vehicle, moving with the disciplined stealth of experienced operators. Despite never having conducted operations together before, their coordination was seamless, a testament to shared training, shared values, shared purpose. As they neared the command position, Frank could hear Wallace issuing orders, his voice tense but controlled, directing the coordinated breach attempt against the ranch house. 2 communications operators worked from equipment set up beside the vehicle, maintaining tactical coordination between assault teams. Frank reached his position simultaneously with Maria, their timing synchronized without need for signals or confirmation. He caught her eye across the short distance separating them, saw her slight nod indicating readiness. 3, 2, 1. They moved in perfect coordination, Maria targeting the communications equipment with precise fire that disabled the tactical network without risking the operators. Frank advancing directly on Wallace with weapon-trained center mass. Stand down, Colonel, he ordered, voice carrying the unmistakable authority of combat command. It's over. Wallace spun toward the unexpected threat, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before freezing as he registered the tactical situation, 2 weapons trained on him. His communications disabled his command position, compromised. For a fraction of a second, Frank saw calculation in the colonel's eyes, assessing options, weighing risks, considering resistance despite the apparent disadvantage. I wouldn't, Frank advised quietly. Not worth dying for corporate interest, Colonel. Something flickered across Wallace's face, surprised perhaps at the direct reference to his true motivation. Then his military discipline reasserted itself, and he slowly raised his hands. Captain Ramirez, he acknowledged, voice cold. And Sergeant Harmon, impressive tactical maneuver. Order your men to stand down, Maria demanded, maintaining her position, covering the communications operators who had frozen at their stations. Now, Colonel. Wallace's jaw tightened, the internal struggle visible despite his controlled exterior. The sound of gunfire continued from the direction of the ranch, his assault still underway, his men still following the last orders he'd issued. They're fighting for what they believe is legitimate authority, Frank observed, understanding the colonel's hesitation. But you know it isn't. You know what this is really about, what you've done, who you're really serving. Something shifted in Wallace's expression, not surrender, not remorse, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one professional soldier to another that the tactical situation had changed, that adaptation was necessary. He reached slowly for the radio at his belt, maintaining eye contact with Frank. Allow me to issue the stand-down order. Frank nodded once, permission granted, but vigilance maintained. Wallace keyed the radio, his voice resuming the command tone that had directed the assault. All units, this is Wallace. Stand down immediately. Repeat, all units, stand down. Operation compromised, tactical withdrawal authorized. For several seconds, nothing changed, the gunfire continuing from the direction of the ranch, the assault teams presumably uncertain about the unexpected order. Wallace keyed the radio again. Authentication code, Echo Bravo 73. Stand down immediately. Withdrawal protocol engaged. This time the effect was immediate. The gunfire began to diminish, sporadic rather than coordinated, as assault teams processed the authenticated order and began disengaging from their positions. Maria's radio crackled with Torres's voice. Captain, hostile forces disengaging. Repeat enemy withdrawing from all positions. What's your status? Command element secured, Maria responded. Colonel Wallace in custody, maintained defensive positions until full withdrawal confirmed. Frank maintained his focus on Wallace, recognizing in the colonel's controlled exterior the dangerous calculation beneath a commander who had lost this engagement but was already planning the next, already assessing options for continued operation. It's truly over, Colonel, he said quietly. The FBI has your communications with Meridian Resources. They have the mineral surveys, the transfer records, the operational timeline. They know what this was really about. Wallace's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension in his shoulders suggested the impact of Frank's words. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in, Sergeant. The implications, the connections, the authority behind this operation. I know enough, Frank replied. I know you ordered American soldiers to murder civilians for corporate profit. I know you hunted those soldiers when they refused an illegal order. I know you attacked federal agents, compromised military authority, violated your oath. Something flashed in Wallace's eyes, then anger perhaps, or the dangerous pride of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. You speak of oaths, of military obligation. You abandoned yours, Sergeant, disappeared to lick your wounds while better men continued to serve. The words were calculated to wound, to provoke, to disrupt Frank's tactical focus with emotional response. 5 years ago, they might have succeeded. But the man standing before Wallace now wasn't the broken soldier who had retreated to Lone Pine Ranch in grief and isolation. I lost my way, Frank acknowledged simply. These women helped me find it again, by reminding me what service really means. Before Wallace could respond, the sound of approaching helicopters cut through the morning air, not the tactical assault craft his forces might have deployed, but the distinctive engine signature of federal transport. FBI reinforcement, Maria confirmed, checking her watch. Ahead of schedule? Wallace's expression tightened, the final recognition that his operation had truly failed, that his freedom, his career, his carefully constructed power base were all forfeit. But still, the dangerous calculation remained in his eyes. A man who believed himself above conventional justice, who retained connections that might yet shield him from the full consequences of his actions. This isn't the end, he said quietly, the words meant for Frank alone. For you, Colonel, I think it is, Frank replied. As the helicopters approached landing in the open field beyond the ranch house, the morning sun illuminated the battlefield they had created together. The bullet-scarred buildings, the discarded tactical gear, the wounded being tended by both sides. The aftermath of violence undertaken for vastly different purposes, one to hide truth, one to protect it. Frank maintained his position, guarding Wallace as federal agents approached their location, weapons-ready protocols engaged. The formal transfer of custody would follow procedures, documentation, the machinery of justice beginning its deliberate process. But in this moment, in the harsh Texas sunlight, with Maria beside him and Wallace before him, Frank Harmon felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. The clarity of purpose, the certainty of right action, the knowledge that he had fought for something that mattered. Not for country, not for command, not for abstract principles of duty or honor, but for truth, for justice, for the future those concepts made possible, for the life that might await him when the battle was truly done. Retreat a song chua edit. To chua hoan tain, kan tip tuk viet van nam daela van kui kong tau jenny, ban kamun to tip tuk viet van num. Ket tuk va di san kai nei kong retreat a oki not di edit. 1 year had passed since the battle at Lone Pine Ranch. The Texas summer sun beat down on the newly constructed pavilion, its wooden beams still fragrant with pine resin, its metal roof gleaming in the afternoon light. Around it, the ranch had transformed buildings, repaired and expanded new structures. Risen from the scarred earth, the single pine tree now joined by a dozen saplings planted in careful formation. Frank Harmon stood on the porch of the main house, watching as vehicles arrived along the newly graveled driveway, trucks, SUVs, a few motorcycles, all converging on what had once been his sanctuary of solitude. Now the property hummed with purpose, with movement, with life, with future. The trial of Colonel James Wallace had concluded 3 months earlier, after nearly 9 months of legal maneuvering, classified hearings, and political pressure from various quarters. In the end, the evidence had been too substantial to overcome, even with his connections, communications records, financial transfers, operational plans, and most damning of all, the testimony of 11 Rangers who had refused his illegal order. 25 years in federal prison, dishonorable discharge, stripping of rank and decorations, a sentence that had sent shockwaves through certain quarters of power in Washington, where the entanglement of military authority and corporate interest had long operated in shadowed cooperation. 3 executives from Meridian Resources had also faced justice: conspiracy, attempted murder, illegal use of military assets. The corporation itself had been fined hundreds of millions, its stock value decimated, its operations under federal oversight. Justice as complete as the system allowed. Frank watched as a familiar figure emerged from a recently arrived SUV, Maria Ramirez, no longer in uniform, but still carrying herself with military bearing, despite civilian clothes. She paused, surveying the transformed property with appreciative eyes before spotting Frank on the porch. As she approached, Frank noted the subtle changes. A year had brought her hair slightly longer, her posture a fraction less rigid, her eyes carrying the weight of experience, but also something new, something like peace. "Sergeant Harmon," she greeted, a small smile touching her lips. "Captain Ramirez," he returned, the formality familiar, comfortable between them, despite all that had changed. "Not anymore," she corrected gently. "Just Maria now. Civilian life takes some getting used to." Frank nodded, understanding intimately the adjustment from military identity to civilian existence. "How's the transition treating you?" "Day by day," she replied, joining him at the porch railing. "The team is doing well for the most part. Torres started physical therapy school. Johnson joined a cybersecurity firm. Diaz is working with a veterans advocacy group in Washington." "And you?" Frank asked. Maria's gaze moved across the ranch, taking in the new buildings, the training areas, the vegetable gardens, tended by figures in various stages of recovery. "I'm finding my way. The testimony at Wallace's trial opened some doors, closed others. Speaking truth has consequences, good and bad." Frank understood. Maria and her team had been both vindicated and vilified heroes, to those who valued their moral courage, threats to those who preferred military obedience without ethical complication. Their testimony had exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of military command and corporate influence, had forced resignations, investigations, reforms, had made powerful enemies. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Maria considered the question with characteristic thoroughness before answering. "Not about refusing the order, not about protecting the village, not about testifying." She paused. "Maybe about trusting the system as long as I did. About not seeing sooner what was happening around us." Frank nodded, accepting her assessment without judgment. Every soldier who served long enough faced that moment of recognition when the ideals that prompted their service collided with the realities of how power operated, how authority could corrupt, how institutions could fail their stated purpose. "You saw it when it mattered most," he offered, "when lives were into the balance." Maria's expression softened slightly. "As did you in Kandahar. As did you here when you opened your door that night." Before Frank could respond, another vehicle approached, a sedan civilian, driven with careful precision up the gravel drive. It parked near the pavilion, and Frank's heart rate accelerated as the passenger door opened. Anna stepped out, taller than she'd been 3 months ago at their last visit, her dark hair caught in a ponytail, her 10-year-old face serious as she surveyed the unfamiliar surroundings. Behind her, Sandra emerged from the driver's seat, offering a tentative wave toward the porch. "Your daughter?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer from their conversations over the past year. "Yeah," Frank confirmed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Third visit since the trial, first time here at the ranch." Maria touched his arm lightly, a soldier's gesture of support before battle. "Go, we'll talk more later." Frank descended the porch steps, moving toward his daughter with the measured pace of a man trying not to appear too eager, too desperate for connection. The court-mandated therapy had helped him understand the delicate balance required to be present, without overwhelming, to offer connection, without demanding it, to acknowledge the years of absence while building something new. Anna saw him approaching and straightened slightly, a child trying to appear composed in an unfamiliar situation. Frank stopped, a respectful distance away, allowing her the space to adjust, to decided, "Hi, Anna," he said simply. "Hi," she replied, her voice quiet but not fearful. She glanced around at the busy ranch, curiosity evident in her expression. "This is where you live?" "Yes," Frank confirmed. This is Lone Pine Ranch. Anna pointed toward the cluster of pine saplings near the pavilion. But there's more than one pine tree. Frank felt a smile tug at his lips, his daughter's literal observation cutting through the emotional complexity of the moment. There is now. We planted those last fall. We, Anna asked, picking up on the specific word. The people who live and work here now, Frank explained. Veterans mostly, people who needed a place to recover to rebuild. Anna considered this, her young face serious in contemplation. Like you did, Mom says you needed time to heal after Mom died. The direct reference to Rebecca caught Frank off guard, a momentary tightness in his chest at the casual mention of his greatest loss. But he recognized the opening Anna was offering, the permission to acknowledge their shared past, their shared pain. Yes, he said carefully, like I did. Though I didn't do it very well at first. I hid away instead of healing. Anna nodded, absorbing this with the peculiar wisdom children sometimes display in moments of emotional significance. Are you better now? The question, so simple, so direct, so fundamental, struck Frank with unexpected force. Was he better after 5 years of isolation, the violent intrusion of Maria's team, the battles fought, the testimony given, the slow rebuilding of his life's purpose? I'm getting there, he answered honestly. Each day a little more. Something in his candid response seemed to satisfy Anna. She turned to Sandra, who had maintained a respectful distance during their exchange. Can I see the horses Uncle Frank mentioned? Sandra looked to Frank for confirmation, maintaining the careful co-parenting balance they were gradually establishing. Frank nodded, grateful for her understanding. The stable is just past the pavilion, he said. Sarah is probably there. She takes care of the horses. Tell her I sent you. As Anna moved toward the stables with Sandra following at a discreet distance, Frank felt Maria's presence beside him again. She has your eyes, she observed quietly, and your directness. Frank smiled slightly. Her mother's determination, though. Rebecca never let anything stand in her way once she'd decided on a course of action. They watched in companionable silence as Anna approached the stables, where Sarah, no longer a frightened 19-year-old private, but a confident young woman, with purpose in her stride, greeted her with a warm smile. Sarah's doing well, Frank noted. The responsibility has been good for her. And Hope, Maria asked, referring to the infant they had rescued from the border village. Officially adopted last month, Frank replied. The courts fast-tracked the process given the circumstances. She's walking now, talking a little, growing stronger every day. As if summoned by the mentions, Sarah emerged from the stable leading a gentle mare. Hope balanced securely on her hip, a toddler, now with dark curls and bright eyes, reaching eagerly toward the horse with fearless curiosity. A family forged in fire, Maria observed, watching as Anna cautiously approached the horse under Sarah's guidance. Many families here. Frank agreed, his gaze taking in the various figures moving around the property, veterans in different stages of recovery, some still carrying the visible wounds of combat, others bearing scars visible only in their eyes and their posture, in the careful way they move through the world. Whispering Pines Haven, the sign at the entrance, now proclaimed, a place of recovery, of rebuilding, of second chances. The transformation had begun shortly after Wallace's arrest, as Frank and Maria had stood amid the bullet-scarred buildings, surveying the damage of battle, considering what came next. This place, Maria had said, it protected us when we needed it most. Perhaps it could do the same for others. The idea had taken root immediately, converting Lone Pine Ranch from private fortress to healing sanctuary, from isolation to community, from retreat to engagement. With Maria's connections to veteran support networks, with the publicity from Wallace's trial creating awareness, with Frank's property and determination providing foundation, Whispering Pines Haven had emerged from the scarred battlefield. Now, a year later, 27 veterans called it home, some for short-term recovery, others for longer rebuilding, all finding in its structured environment and supportive community the stability their transition to civilian life required. Frank led specialized training in rural skills construction, animal husbandry, land management. Maria, during her frequent visits, conducted group sessions on transition challenges, on processing combat experience, on finding new purpose beyond military identity, a healing place for healer and healed alike. The pavilion looks good, Maria commented, nodding toward the nearly completed structure. Ready for tomorrow's ceremony. Final touches this afternoon, Frank confirmed. The memorial wall is installed, just waiting on the plaques. Tomorrow marked the official dedication of the Haven, a ceremony that would bring together supporters, veterans advocates, media representatives, and most significantly family members of those lost in conflicts, both foreign and domestic. The memorial wall would bear their names, their sacrifice acknowledged, their memory honored in the continued healing of those who survived. A year of building, of planning, of creating something that would outlast the battles that had made it necessary. As the afternoon progressed, more vehicles arrived. Torres with her rehabilitated leg, Johnson with her quiet competence, Diaz with her technological expertise, all returning for the dedication ceremony, all bringing their specialized skills to contribute to the Haven's continued development. Frank watched from various vantage points around the property as they integrated seamlessly into the community. Torres conducting a physical therapy session for a Marine with a prosthetic limb, Johnson upgrading the Haven's security systems, Diaz documenting veteran stories for an advocacy project. Women who had once been hunted by their own command, now building something constructive from that betrayal, channeling their disillusionment into reform, their trauma into healing, their experience into wisdom. As dusk approached, the community gathered in the main dining hall, a converted barn now filled with long wooden tables, its walls adorned with photographs of recovery milestones, its atmosphere warm with the scent of home-cooked food and the sound of shared conversation. Frank found himself at the center table surrounded by a constellation of relationships that would have been unimaginable to him a year earlier. Maria beside him, Anna across from him, Sarah and Hope nearby, Torres and Johnson and the others, scattered throughout, veterans of various eras, engaged in the universal soldiers' conversation that transcended specific conflicts. A community, a purpose, a future. After dinner, as the gathering dispersed into smaller groups, Frank found a quiet moment with Anna on the porch swing, the same swing where he had once sat alone, night after night, where he had first truly spoken with Maria during those tense hours before Wallace's initial attack. "Do all these people live here?" Anna asked, taking in the activity around the property. Veterans gathered around fire pits, walking paths together, finding moments of connection and shared experience. "Some do," Frank explained. "Others come for training, for recovery, then move on when they're ready." Anna considered this, swinging her legs thoughtfully. "Were they all in wars?" "Most of them," Frank confirmed. "Different wars, different experiences, but similar challenges afterward." "Like being sad and angry inside?" Anna asked the question, carrying a child's perception of complex or emotional trauma. Frank measured his response carefully, respecting both her age and her insight. "Something like that, yes. When people experience difficult things, sometimes those feelings get stuck inside. This place helps them find ways to unstick them." Anna nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. "That's good." She hesitated, then added, with the directness only children truly master. "Were you sad and angry inside after Mom died?" The question pierced Frank with its simple accuracy, its gentle perception of what he had only recently begun to acknowledge fully in therapy. "Yes," he admitted. "Very sad, very angry. For a long time." "That's why you went away?" "Yes. But it wasn't the right way to handle those feelings." Frank chose his words with care, aware of the importance of this moment, of the foundation it might create for their rebuilding relationship. "I thought being alone would make the sadness smaller, but it just gave it more room to grow." Anna absorbed this, her young face solemn in the fading light. "Are you still sad?" "Sometimes," Frank answered honestly. "I'll always miss your mother. But the sadness isn't stuck inside the same way anymore. And there's room for other feelings too. Good ones." "Like what?" Frank looked at his daughter, this miraculous connection to Rebecca, this second chance he'd nearly forsaken, this future he was gradually learning to embrace. "Like being proud of you," he said simply. "Like being grateful for the chance to know you again. Like hope for what comes next." Anna didn't respond immediately, but after a moment she shifted slightly on the swing, closing the distance between them by a few inches, not dramatic, not demonstrative, but deliberate. A small movement toward connection, toward possibility. They sat together as darkness settled over the ranch, the swing creaking gently, conversations murmuring around them, stars emerging in the Texas sky. Not father and daughter fully reunited, not past wounds completely healed, but something beginning, something growing, something worth fighting for. Later that night, after Anna had gone to sleep in the guest room prepared for her visit, Frank found Maria by the memorial wall in the nearly completed pavilion. She stood before the smooth stone surface illuminated by soft landscape lighting, her finger tracing names not yet marked with permanent plaques, but temporarily indicated with small placards. Villages in Afghanistan and Iraq where civilians had been protected by American forces who chose conscience over orders. Soldiers who had died upholding their moral obligations despite institutional pressure. Communities both foreign and domestic, where the true cost of war had been borne not by decision makers, but by those who lived with the consequences. It matters, Maria said without turning, sensing Frank's presence behind her, that we remember not just our losses, but why they mattered, what they stood for. Frank moved to stand beside her, his own gaze traveling the wall of names, some he recognized from personal experience, others from shared military history, representing the complex reality of service that extended beyond national boundaries, beyond political objectives, into the fundamental humanity that connected all conflicts. Wallace called it weakness, he recalled, caring about civilians, about collateral damage, about the moral implications of orders. He said it made us less effective, less decisive. He was wrong, Maria stated simply. It's our humanity that gives meaning to our service. Without it, we're just weapons pointed by others. Frank nodded, accepting the truth of her assessment. He had seen both kinds of soldiers during his career, those who maintained their moral compass despite institutional pressure, and those who surrendered it in the name of efficiency, of advancement, of belonging. Anna asked if I was still sad, he said after a moment, the transition natural between them despite the apparent change in subject. About Rebecca, about the past. Maria turned slightly toward him, her expression open, attentive. What did you tell her where the truth? That sadness doesn't disappear, but it can make room for other things. Better things. Frank's gaze returned to the memorial wall, to the names that represented both loss and purpose. That moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, just carrying differently. Maria nodded, understanding evident in her expression. Wise words, Sergeant Harmon. Expensive wisdom, Frank acknowledged. 5 years of isolation, nearly losing any relationship with my daughter. Almost missing. He paused, gesturing to the haven around them, to the purpose that they had built together. All of this. They stood in companionable silence, the weight of shared experience, creating a connection that required no elaboration, no explanation. Two soldiers who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in protecting the best of it, who had faced institutional betrayal and still found purpose in service, albeit redefined on their own terms. Will you stay? Frank asked finally, the question that had remained unspoken between them for months. Not just visits, not just consulting, actually join the haven permanently. Maria didn't respond immediately, her gaze returning to the memorial wall, her expression thoughtful. I've been considering it, she admitted. My contract with the Veterans Advocacy Group ends next month. I've accomplished what I went there to do, establish protocols, create documentation systems, train staff. We need you here, Frank said simply. Your experience, your perspective, your leadership. The veterans respond to you differently than to me. Because you're the gruff sergeant who makes them rebuild fences in the Texas heat. Maria observed a small smile touching her lips. While you're the captain who helps them understand why the fence matters, Frank completed. Different approach, same goal. Complementary. Maria turned to face him fully, her expression serious despite the earlier lightness. Is that what we are, Frank, complementary? The question carried weight beyond professional collaboration, beyond the haven's operational needs. Frank met her gaze steadily, acknowledging the deeper inquiry beneath her words. I think, he said carefully, that we understand each other in ways few others could. We've seen the same darkness, made similar choices, paid comparable prices. He paused, finding the right words for what had developed between them over the past year, the gradual shift from tactical allies to trusted confidants, to something more complex, more meaningful. And I think we both recognize the value of building something that matters, something that lasts beyond the battles. Maria nodded slowly, accepting his assessment. Not a conventional foundation for whatever this might be. Nothing about either of us has ever been conventional, Frank pointed out. That drew a genuine smile from her, rare but transformative, when it appeared illuminating her face with a warmth that combat and command had rarely allowed her to display. True enough, she agreed. And yes, I'll stay. The haven needs what I can offer. And she hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. I find value in what we're building here. Together. The simple acknowledgement settled between them. Not a dramatic declaration, not an emotional pronouncement, but the measured commitment of two people who understood the weight of words, the significance of choice, the value of deliberate connection. Tomorrow would bring the dedication ceremony, speeches, media, the official launch of Whispering Pines Haven as a recognized Veterans Recovery Center. There would be challenges ahead, funding to secure programs to develop the ongoing healing of those who came seeking recovery, including Frank himself. But in this moment, standing before the memorial wall that honored both sacrifice and survival, Frank Harmon felt something he had thought permanently lost in the wreckage of his previous life: possibility. Future. The quiet certainty that whatever came next, he would face it not in isolation but in community. Not in retreat but in engagement. Not alone but connected to a constellation of relationships that gave meaning to survival. As they walked back toward the main house, the Texas night alive with cicada song and distant conversation. Frank glanced toward the guest room where Anna slept, his daughter gradually returning to his life through careful rebuilding, through consistent presence, through the patient work of earning trust again. Beyond her window, the stars scattered across the vast Texas sky like possibilities waiting to be recognized. The same stars that had witnessed his grief-stricken isolation, his reluctant re-engagement with the world, his defense of Maria's team, his testimony against Wallace, his gradual rebuilding of purpose and connection. The same stars that would witness whatever came next, the continued development of the Haven, the gradual healing of its residents, the strengthening of his relationship with Anna, the evolution of his connection with Maria. The future, unwritten but full of possibility, stretching before him like the Texas horizon at dawn. Not the end of his story, but perhaps the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Not a complete healing, some wounds never fully closed, but a purposeful carrying forward of both scars and strength. Not a perfect resolution, but a meaningful continuation. Frank Harmon had once built a fortress to keep the world at bay, to protect himself from further loss, to contain his grief within walls of isolation. Now standing on the porch of what had become Whispering Pines Haven, he recognized the deeper truth that Maria and her team had helped him rediscover. That true strength came not from walls, but from connections, not from isolation, but from community, not from hiding wounds, but from healing them together. The last fortress was not a place, but a purpose, not a structure, but a commitment, not an end, but a beginning. And as the Texas night deepened around them, stars burning against the infinite darkness, Frank Harmon stood at his threshold, not alone, not broken, but ready for whatever battle or blessing might come next. Ready to build rather than hide. Ready to connect rather than withdraw. Ready to live rather than merely survive. Ready at last for the future that had been waiting for him to find his way back to it all along.